The odious smell that permeated the dungeon had grown no less pervasive, but Elijah ignored it as he stalked forward. On either side of the hall were more cages not dissimilar from the one in which he'd left the troll. However, they were mostly empty, and the ones that were occupied contained only corpses of fearsome beasts. The only ones Elijah recognized were smaller trolls, but even those were so plague-stricken that he could barely make the connection between them and the sole living monster within the dungeon. Certainly, he hadn't intended to empathize with that creature, but after seeing what had happened to the other prisoners within the dungeon, he couldn't help but feel sorry for the troll. Whatever it had done to earn its captivity certainly wasn't enough to force it to endure the torturous existence with which it had been afflicted. Making it worse was that, according to the Ulthrax back in the Kell-Edge Tower, there was a good chance that a real consciousness was buried somewhere inside that monstrous form. The thought sent a shiver up Elijah's spine. Gradually, he progressed through the dungeon, memorizing the twists and turns of its disgusting hallways along the way. He saw a few more ogre jailers, but there was nothing to indicate that any of them were the warden he sought to complete his task. Still, after exiting the troll's cell and leaving its curiously attentive gaze behind, Elijah had no issues hiding from the ogre jailers. But it only took the memory of his previous fight to tell him that attacking those bulky creatures was a mistake. Even with the benefit of Predator's strike on his side, getting through those thick layers of fat and muscle was a tall task. Perhaps he could kill them on his own, but there was enough doubt that he couldn't commit to that path. After all, if he failed to quickly kill one, his would-be victim would almost assuredly raise the alarm. In that event, Elijah's chances of survival would fall to almost nothing. So he chose caution instead. As he continued to stalk through the dungeon, he flared one with nature as often as possible. And he discovered something he'd already suspected: it was far less effective indoors than it was out in nature. Back in Ironshore and then in Norcastle he'd noticed as much, but being in the Reaver's Citadel confirmed that the spell worked much better in the untamed wilderness. Still, it wasn't completely ineffective, and it still gave his attributes an invisible boost. Fortunately, his other enhancements worked the same as always, bolstering his dexterity, regeneration, and constitution by a significant degree. That made his task much easier, and he managed to avoid detection until, at last, he'd mapped the entire dungeon. And what he'd discovered wasn't ideal. First, there was only one exit, and that was guarded by 4 ogres wearing black iron armor like the ones he'd seen near the gatehouses outside. Otherwise, there were 4 jailers scattered throughout the dungeon as well. But their presence wasn't what truly worried him. No, that distinction belonged to his discovery of the warden. He'd expected another ogre, but what he'd found was something altogether different. Elijah stood in the corner of what could only be called a torture room, where he stared at a black-skinned elf. The man was short and slender, with prominently tapered ears and a mane of thick, white hair. Like many of the ogres Elijah had seen, he wore a suit of bulky, black armor, though his had been embellished with a series of silver whorls that sparkled with stored Ethera. Elijah didn't have to study it for long before he became convinced that it was magical in nature. So was the slender sword at his hip, which glimmered with the same silvery metal. However, Elijah was less concerned with his attire or race, for that matter, than the fact that he was gleefully torturing what looked like a taller, bulkier goblin. Even more disturbingly, the elf wasn't asking any questions. He didn't seek information. Instead, he was clearly tormenting the creature for no more reason than because he wanted to hear it scream. Even if Elijah hadn't been tasked with killing the elf, he would have committed himself to that endeavor right then and there. Killing was often necessary. That was the cost of survival. Even torture, for some misguided individuals, might hold some value as an interrogation method. He'd heard that it didn't really work, but Elijah could at least follow the logic that would lead someone down that road. But torture for torture's sake was absolutely abhorrent, and Elijah had no intention of letting it continue. Still, he knew he couldn't attack without a plan, so he retreated through those same halls and back to the jail cell where he'd killed the ogre jailer. After he'd slain the creature, Elijah had shifted into his scaled 8 form, and tossed the heavy corpse to the troll as a distraction. As one monster fed on the remains of another, Elijah had resumed his human form, rushed forward, and cast healing rain. The troll had ignored him, and over the course of the spell's duration, those painfully popping pustules of caustic ooze had slowly shrunk. They weren't gone, but the troll looked as if it was in far less pain. Moreover, the formation of the cysts and the oozes that came from them had become less frequent, suggesting that Elijah's efforts hadn't been for naught. It also looked a good deal less infuriated, which was key for Elijah's plan. After resuming his human form, he raised his hand in what he hoped was a placating gesture, then stepped forward. The troll shifted, obviously noticing Elijah's progress. But it didn't rush him, so he took another step. Then another when it showed no further reaction. Finally, Elijah was close enough that another cast of his spell would envelop the creature, so he used healing rain, then retreated. Even as heavy drops of rejuvenating precipitation fell, Elijah crouched on the other side of the cell. He knew better than to expect to have tamed the troll. A single meal and a little healing could only do so much, after all. So he never allowed his awareness to waver. At the same time, he studied the cell itself, a task only possible because of his faceted quartz mind. If he'd tried to pay attention to so many things, his domain, one with nature, the cell, and the troll, before he'd advanced his cultivation, he would have no doubt been lost in the weeds. But now, it was a simple task to compartmentalize the disparate thoughts. Still, he was pushing the limits of his mind by fostering even those simple strains of thought. Perhaps once he advanced to the next stage, the facets would expand and allow for more complex thinking. For now, though, anything more than cataloging sensory input required the full weight of his mind. The cell itself was a simple, rectangular room made of the same stone common across the rest of the dungeon. Most of the floor was covered in a thick layer of algae that even crept a few feet up the walls. However, it was densest near the drainage grate, and the shaft probably meant for waste disposal that split the cell in two. The troll was confined by manacles on its thick wrists and ankles, which were in turn attached to the wall via bulky, black iron chains. Elijah only had eyes for the thick locks holding those manacles together, largely because, after killing the jailer and looting the corpse, he had the means to free the creature. Or so he expected.
Hey everyone, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy the audiobooks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a Patreon member. As a member, you'll gain the ability to request the next part of a novel audiobook I've uploaded, depending on your Patreon tier.
He glanced down at the key in his hand and contemplated how he might accomplish that feat at first. He'd hoped that healing and feeding the troll might engender some sense of cooperation, but that clearly wasn't going to happen. It would tolerate his presence only so long as it couldn't kill him. The moment it was freed, he would become its target. Was the optional part of the task a fool's errand? Was there no way to complete it? Elijah knew that towers could accommodate up to 6 people, and that they were usually meant to be challenged by those groups. Entering into such a situation alone was regarded as only a step above suicidal, largely because the challenges necessary for completion not only required incredible strength, but they usually necessitated a wide variety of skills as well. So he had no doubts that there were probably classes that could easily combat and conquer his current dilemma. But he just didn't have the necessary skills to pacify the monster. If it had been an animal, perhaps it would have been possible. He could have treated it like the bear guarding the Amanita he'd encountered. But the troll was clearly something else. It wasn't sapient, but it wasn't an animal either. Or if it was intelligent enough not to fall prey to the placating manipulation of one with nature. Elijah continued to ponder the problem as healing rain did its work. When the spell faded, he darted close and recast it. The troll tolerated him, and yet, Elijah knew that if he tarried for even a second too long, it would destroy him. After the third cast, he started to wonder why he was even bothering with healing the creature. It wasn't real. And as far as he knew, the moment he conquered the dungeon, the troll would reset just like everything else. Yet, he couldn't just ignore its suffering. So he continued along, reapplying healing rain for more times over the next few hours. And in that way, the troll was healed. It was only when he saw the way the now healthy troll strained the plates attaching the chains to the wall that a plan began to take shape. It wasn't ideal. He knew that there were a host of ways it could go wrong. But he also suspected that, without the assistance the troll could provide, he stood little chance of bypassing the guards, much less killing the warden. Was it possible? Certainly. But not probable. So he latched onto another, arguably just as dangerous, plan. But given that it didn't involve him attacking an entity of entirely unknown strength, he preferred it over squaring off against the warden in straight fight. As soon as Elijah saw that the troll had been completely healed, he settled down to renew his stores of Ethera. Flexing every facet of his quartz mind, he dragged 9 streams of energy through his soul and into his core, enhancing his regeneration by a good amount. It took no small degree of concentration, but it was effective, so long as he wasn't too distracted. Gradually, his core refilled, and after he renewed his augmentations, essence of the monkey, essence of the boar, aura of renewal, one with nature, and finally, essence of the wolf, he embraced shape of the guardian and shifted into the scaled ape form. Without hesitation, he launched himself forward with every point of his enhanced strength attribute. And considering the augmentation provided by the guardian form, he could bring quite a bit of power to bear. He launched himself forward, accelerating like a sports car before slamming into the wall with incredible force. The troll, for all its wariness, never even had a chance to react before Elijah kicked off the wall and threw himself to the other side of the cell, where he skidded for a few feet before his momentum ended in a collision with the other wall. Shifting back into his human form, he immediately cast Touch of Nature as he shook his mangled hand. His constitution attribute was incredible in his guardian form, but the anatomy of whatever creature upon which it had been based was not suited for punching. Instead, it was meant to rip and tear with its claws. As a result, he'd broken a couple of bones in his hand. But that was what his healing spells were for, and after 2 casts, he managed to mend his bones. At that point, he took a look at his handiwork, and when he laid his eyes on the brickwork surrounding the anchor, he felt a mixture of disappointment and encouragement. The first was due to the fact that, for all the power he'd managed to harness, the results were decidedly minor. A few tiny cracks, and that was it. However, he was also encouraged by that small effect, if only because it proved that his plan was a viable one. Now, though, the troll was awake and aware, which made his job that much more difficult. He'd surprised it once, but that seemed like, wait, what was it doing? The troll had shifted to the side. It could only move a few feet, but the meaning seemed clear. It was giving Elijah a free shot. Did it understand what he was doing? That seemed to be the case, but... well, Elijah wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. So, after healing himself and regenerating the Ethera he'd spent in the process, he shifted back to his guardian form, and once again launched himself at the anchor. This time, he used his palm to strike the wall, which seemed to bear the impact much better than his delicate knuckles. It was also a little less effective, but that initial punch had served to weaken the brickwork enough that it didn't matter overmuch. Over and over, Elijah threw himself at the wall until he jarred the first anchor loose. And with that proof of concept buoying his efforts, he wasted no time before assaulting the other 3. It took quite some time, and periodically, Elijah was forced to shift back into his human form in order to heal the damage he was doing to his own body. He also tried to use the key on the troll's manacles, but predictably, it slapped him across the room the moment he started groping around its wrist. Still, he eventually managed to accomplish his goal. It was just in time, too, because only a few moments after he'd regenerated his Ethera, the door to the cell screeched as someone opened it. Elijah didn't hesitate to enact the next part of his plan, which began and ended with him diving down the descending shaft just in time to avoid being seen. He dug his fingers into the algae-covered walls, arresting his momentum as the sound of footsteps thundered in his ears. "Look not sick no more," came a deep baritone. "Look same to me. You no see good." "Yeah. You ugly. You ugly." A second later, Elijah heard something that sounded like someone had slapped a side of beef, which was followed by a noise not unlike a deflating bellows. Then the second ogre said, "No call me ugly or you get more fist." The other ogre began to offer a wheezing response when it was cut off by the sound of crumbling mortar, clinking chains, and cantankerous troll. It was music to Elijah's ears. AD. Report. The floor of the cell shook with titanic battle as the two ogres clashed with the freed troll. Warbling screams filled the air, suggesting that things were not going well for the jailers. That was as expected. The troll wasn't just larger, but it had looked far sturdier as well. Still, even if the winner had been assured, which was no certain thing, Elijah had no intentions of letting it play out. Not without having his say. So, wedged in the shaft, he shifted his way up until only his head poked above the floor. When he did, he saw precisely what he had expected. The massive troll had everything it could handle as it fended off the other two creatures, but it was clearly in control of the fight. The ogres were powerful enough to hold their own, though, and it looked like it was going to be a long, drawn-out fight. Elijah aimed to change that. So, without further hesitation, he gripped the staff of natural harmony and channeled Ethera into swarm. Spell. Swarm. Conjure a swarm of pests that infect your enemies with appropriate afflictions. The spell wasn't as devastating as calamity. However, it had the benefit of being far more subtle, which was precisely what he needed at the moment. He released the spell, and a few seconds later, a few biting flies manifested before landing on the broad, naked back of one of the ogre jailers. A second or two later, it was joined by a veritable horde or, appropriately, a swarm of flies. The bulk of the little insects attacked the same ogre, but the nature of a swarm meant that there were plenty of others for the other jailer as well as the troll. Now that the troll had been freed, and he'd gotten the appropriate credit, he thought nothing of using it for his ends. Certainly, he didn't want to watch it suffer, but that didn't mean he would spare the aggressive creature out of some misguided sense of friendship. If it lived, that was fine. But if it ended up dying, Elijah wanted his afflictions to ensure that he got at least some kill energy from its passing. Besides, he needed it angry and raging, or it wouldn't be much of a distraction. The flies didn't last long, and by the time they dissipated into motes of Ethera, Elijah had already retreated into the shaft where he hoped to avoid notice long enough that he could exit combat. Meanwhile, the battle continued, and through the use of One with Nature, he kept track of the three combatants' conditions. The ogres had clearly gotten the worst of it, and the one who'd shouldered the brunt of the impact looked like it was only a hair's breadth from passing out. Wet, clammy skin, splotchy cheeks, and unsteady legs were only the most apparent of its symptoms, and Elijah knew that it certainly wasn't fighting at full strength. The same could be said for the other ogre jailer as well as the troll, but there was enough of a difference that it was only a matter of time before the most affected ogre fell. It ended up coming sooner rather than later when the troll hammered the ogre with a giant, meaty fist that sent it splattering against the wall. Even as the masonry crumbled, the troll pounced, hammering the unfortunate ogre with all its might. Elijah only caught glimpses here and there all via One with Nature, but he got the impression that the pummeling was similar to what one might see from a silverback gorilla. In any case, the ogre was done for, and though it continued to fend the troll off with everything it could muster, its fellow could read the writing on the wall. And when it did, the remaining ogre jailer didn't swoop in to save its comrade. Instead, he turned tail and ran, dashing through the door as quickly as its meaty proportions would allow. At first, the troll paid it no mind, but the moment it finally finished with its gruesome and single-minded task, it whirled around to look for another victim. When it didn't find one, the formerly imprisoned troll let out a frustrated roar, then squeezed through the cell door no small feat, given its larger size, and took off down the hall. Elijah waited a few moments before he climbed out of the shaft, and the moment he saw the devastation that had been wrought on the cell, his reticence to engage the ogres or the troll in battle was reaffirmed. The walls were cracked, with one of them covered in blood, and large chunks of brick had been torn away. But that was nothing compared to the state of the ogre the troll had killed. From the shoulders down, it was much the same as Elijah had expected. Just a large, corpulent body composed of equal parts fat and muscle. However, from the neck up was just a mass of unidentifiable meat and exposed bone. The troll hadn't just beaten the thing to death. Indeed, he'd rendered it entirely unrecognizable. Seeing that, it was easy for Elijah to imagine that the ogre jailer's death had been a mere byproduct of the troll venting its rage and frustration. Elijah wasted no more time inspecting the site of the battle. Instead, he quickly shifted into the shape of the predator and slipped into the guise of the unseen. Only then did the tension in his mind dissipate, and he slipped from the cell, secure in his own invisibility. As soon as he did, he saw more evidence of the troll's passage. Unlike the cell's door, the corridor was easily large enough to accommodate even the enormous troll, and yet, it looked like the creature had gone out of its way to smash into everything it saw. More cracked walls were the most obvious sign of its ire, but it had also torn torches from their sconces and dented other cell doors. Elijah followed the trail of destruction as he made his way through the dungeon, his passage accompanied by the echoing sounds and ongoing battle up ahead. Along the way, he saw the bodies of the remaining ogre jailers. The troll had clearly used the weight of surprise to ease the battle, and he'd dispatched the unarmored creatures without even slowing down. Elijah padded forward, his feet silent as he crept from one flickering shadow to the next. He knew it wasn't strictly necessary guise of the unseen, as well as his form's ability to change color was enough to render him nearly invisible, but he didn't want to take any chances. As such, his progress was much slower than it likely should have been. Even so, he reached the source of the noise only a couple of minutes later. By the time he caught sight of the troll, Elijah couldn't help but let out a silent gasp of horror. It bore hundreds of wounds. Some were small pinpricks for a creature of its size, but some gaped open, with huge flaps of skin flopping around with every movement. Its opponents hadn't fared any better, though. 4 armored ogre guards encircled the troll, harrying it with their massive weapons. However, despite their brutish appearance, the ogres displayed no small degree of cooperation and finesse, hemming the creature in and slowly whittling it down with superior reach and the weight of numbers. That simply would not do. So Elijah retreated to the chamber's door, then ducked out of sight before resuming his human form. Then, he once again used Swarm, sending a cascade of biting flies to inflict their afflictions on the ogre guards. Fortunately, their armor proved no obstacle to the tiny insects, and before the swarm dissipated, the 4 remaining guards, one had been completely incapacitated, but it was still alive, while another slumped against the wall, its body misshapen and unmoving had been infected. And even in that short span, the effect had already made itself known. A woozy guard didn't move quite quickly enough to avoid the troll's sudden attack, and as a result, it ended up being slammed against the wall with the force of a runaway train. Predictably, it didn't survive intact, and even from so far away, Elijah could hear cracking bones over the sound of twisting metal. That was when Elijah shifted back into his scaled panther form, automatically embracing guise of the unseen the moment it was available. Then, he settled in to wait. However, even with the numbers tilting slightly more in favor of the troll, it quickly became clear that it was destined to lose. The afflicted ogres couldn't move quite as quickly as before, but the troll hadn't escaped the swarm unscathed either. So, while it wasn't quite as affected as the guards, probably due to a better constitution attribute, or some inherent advantage of being a troll, the gap hadn't widened enough to give it an appreciable advantage. So the fight continued on, settling into a standstill, which meant that Elijah had little choice but to act. After all, it was only a matter of time before the warden responded. And if that dark elf added its weight to the battle, the troll's fate would be sealed. Elijah knew he needed to act before then, because if he didn't have the troll as a distraction, he knew precisely how the fight would go. Perhaps he could use hit-and-run tactics to thin the ogre's numbers, but in a relatively small and enclosed space, he wasn't so sure that was a viable strategy. And that was saying nothing of whether or not they could implement an alarm similar to the one that had outed him at the guardhouse outside. If that happened, he would surely die. So, with those issues pressing down on him, Elijah did the only thing he could. He attacked. Targeting the first ogre proved to be quite difficult, largely because it never quit moving. Moreover, he wanted to time his attack such that he wouldn't be seen. To that end, he needed to use the troll as a shield from the other 2 ogres. So he waited for the perfect moment, and when it presented itself, he pounced. Striking out like an ambushing crocodile, he used Predator Strike before slashing his claws across the back of the ogre's ankle. Then, even as it wailed in anger and pain, he dashed away, slipping through the door before the thing could wheel around. There he waited until, 30 seconds later, he heard the sound of crunching metal before essence of the wolf kicked back in. Now that he was out of combat, Elijah once again embraced guise of the unseen before creeping back into the chamber. True to his expectations, the troll had overcome the wounded guard, and the ogre now lay in a crumpled and motionless heap only a few feet from the other dead guard. There were only 2 remaining, and the troll seemed more than capable of overcoming those odds. Still, Elijah wasn't going to leave that up to chance. So he once again set himself up for another strategic attack, and when it presented itself, he launched himself forward and sliced through the ogre's hamstrings. However, it was only when he whipped around to dart back into the safety of the hallway that he realized that he'd pushed his luck a little too far. The elf, its dull, black iron armor glowing with Ethera, leveled its silver sword in his direction. It started to say something, but Elijah had no interest in hearing some villain's monologue. So, mid-stride, he shifted back into his human form, and preemptively cast Healing Rain. The spell was wide enough to encompass half the room, and even as the storm clouds gathered, Elijah embraced form of the guardian. The call for stealth had faded. Now was the time for unmitigated strength. As he felt his body shifting, Elijah slammed into the wide-eyed elf, but by the time he'd completed his transformation, the creature had recovered his wits enough to once again attempt to speak. And Elijah responded appropriately by harnessing every point of his inflated strength, and ramming his open palm into the elf's chest. A sound like a gong announced contact, and a moment later, the slight creature rocketed backward, hitting the wall with bone-crunching force. Elijah wasted no time before bounding forward, grabbing the stunned elf around the waist, and spinning in place like an Olympic hammer thrower before launching him down the hall. Elijah didn't wait for his opponent to land before he raced back into the room, and threw himself at the injured ogre. His shoulder hit the monster in the hip, eliciting a howl of anger and pain. It hammered a fist against Elijah's back, knocking the breath from his lungs, but he was too close for the ogre to bring its massive weapon to bear. So he bunched his legs and drove himself as well as the ogre into the wall. More bones broke, but more importantly, the guard was stunned by the sudden impact. That gave Elijah the chance he'd been looking for, so he reared back, and brought his clasped hands down on the monster with every ounce of power he could summon. Other than extending the ogre's dazed state, the blow did little good. However, Elijah persisted, repeating the attack. When that didn't finish the guard off, he did it again. And again after that. Over and over, he smashed his scaly fists into the ogre's exposed head. And after the 6th such attack, he was finally rewarded with the feel of a shattering skull beneath his claws. Still, he gave it one more blow for good measure. That one cracked the ogre's skull open like an overripe melon, splattering brain, blood, and bone across the wall. Still, he seethed with a need to keep going. To rip that corpse to pieces with every ounce of his power. Yet, he pushed that aside and forced himself to disengage. He was just in time to see the elf's snarling face, as it drove its silver sword into his chest. Pain lanced through Elijah's chest as the blade parted his scales and drove deep into the meat of his torso only to erupt from his back an instant later. The sheer force of the attack drove him backward until he thudded against the wall, sending a spiderweb of cracks arcing out from the point of impact. Dust and debris rained down on his head as the sword pinned him in place. Panicked, he lashed out, his claws raking against the elf's face. But they never reached his dark skin. The creature smirked and leaned on the hilt of his blade, twisting it cruelly. "Beast," he growled, his voice melodious yet menacing. "You dare strike me?" Elijah hissed and spat as he tried to escape, but the sword's grip was absolute. He couldn't wrench himself free, no matter how hard he pulled. But more distressingly, he felt something being dragged out of him. It wasn't just Ethera. It was something far more vital. His life force, perhaps. Certainly, he felt weaker with every passing second. Desperate to stop that pull, Elijah reached out, his long arms moving with incredible speed, until he wrapped his claws around the elf's wrist. Then, he yanked. The elf clearly hadn't expected that, and the result was a slight stumble in Elijah's direction. It wasn't much, but it was just enough to put him in range of Elijah's sharp fangs. His jaws snapped shut with undeniable power, and the elf's invisible shield shattered. The warden threw himself backward, mitigating some of the damage, but when he recovered only a moment later, long, jagged strips of flesh still hung from his ruined face. Elijah used that small opening to grab hold of the sword and pull. It took every ounce of strength he could bring to bear, but he still managed to yank it free. Then, he roared. At that very moment, the injured troll, having dispatched the final ogre with a thunderous punch, joined the battle. It rushed the still reeling elf, aiming a massive blow in his direction. However, just before it closed the distance, the warden regained his wits and thrust his hand at the monster. Bands of red energy exploded from his fingertips, wrapping around the charging troll's limbs. Then, the elf yanked his arm back, sending the enormous creature flying across the room only to collide with the wall. It didn't stop there, though. Instead, it crashed through the wall, sending bricks flying in an explosion of momentum. Elijah raced forward, raising the sword in an attack. However, he was no swordsman, and his scaled ape form was ill-suited for using weapons. As a result, his intended blow was clumsy and fated for failure. Still, he had surprise on his side, and due to that, he very nearly made contact. The elf moved like a striking snake, though, and despite his heavy-looking armor, he managed to dodge Elijah's attack with inches to spare. But he could do nothing to allay Elijah's charging momentum, which took the form of a shoulder tackle that sent the slender elf flying backwards. He hit the ground a half-dozen feet away, but he didn't skid to a stop until he hit the wall on the other side of the room. Elijah threw the sword aside, then pounced. He never reached his target. With a snarl, the warden swept his hand out, and once again, red bands erupted from his fingers. This time, though, they were aimed at Elijah. For his part, he tried to dodge, but the ribbons of energy seemed to have a mind of their own, following his every move until they slithered around his limbs. And then he was flying through the air, just like the troll before him. He caromed off the remnants of the shattered wall, then cartwheeled across the neighboring cell until he came to rest 24 feet into the room. The guardian shape was incredibly durable. Elijah knew from experience that he could endure all sorts of damage in the scaled ape form. With his hard scales, dense bones, and enhanced constitution, he was like a living tank. However, the limits of his endurance had clearly met their match, because he could already feel multiple broken bones as well as a multitude of shattered scales. And that wasn't even considering the internal damage. He struggled to rise, but he let out a growl of pure agony as his leg collapsed the moment he tried to put weight on it. It was broken in multiple places, he was sure. Elijah looked up to see that the elf had recovered his sword, and was hacking at the grievously wounded troll. The monster's battle with the ogres as well as the aftereffects of Swarm's afflictions had clearly put the creature at a vast disadvantage, and the elf was more than strong enough to exploit the effects of its many injuries. More troublingly, each fall of the warden's sword came with a swirl of Ethera that snaked around his body before being absorbed. With every strike, the elf's wounds healed a little. Elijah knew that if he let that continue, he'd never have a chance of winning the fight. Certainly, he could use Guardian's renewal and heal himself before either resuming the battle or retreating long enough to re-enter stealth. However, by that point, the warden would have completely healed. And even with an ambush, Elijah doubted his chances of defeating the elf if he had the chance to recover. Moreover, he wasn't sure if the elf would allow his retreat. Those red ribbons of energy as spell, obviously, had been inescapable. Who was to say what other abilities the elf possessed? No, Elijah needed to put everything on the line, and all at once, or he would never defeat the warden, much less conquer the tower. With that in mind, he activated Guardian's renewal. Instantly, his bones mended, and his flesh was renewed. In seconds, he was whole, hale, and ready to continue the fight. However, he had no intention of doing so in his scaled ape form. Its endurance and strength had already proven a poor match. So he had other plans. Having regained his health, Elijah shifted back into his human form. The moment he did, he yanked Ethera from his core and cast Swarm. The spell took a decent portion of his available Ethera, but due to his cultivation and ever-increasing core size, which came with each point of the associated attribute, it wasn't nearly as much as it once had been. So, even as the biting flies manifested, he embraced another spell. Spell. Calamity. Bury your enemies beneath the power of nature. Conjure a natural disaster appropriate to your environment. Only usable in caster forms. The Ethera drained out of his core at a rapid pace, flooding the spell with power. Then, Elijah released it, and all hell broke loose. The ground was sundered, the stale air suddenly broke into sharp gusts that would rend flesh, and lightning filled the air. Meanwhile, Elijah was already casting another spell. This time, he preemptively cast Healing Rain before using the last of his Ethera to shift into the shape of the predator. As his scaled panther shape replaced his human form, Elijah raced toward the door. The elf and the troll, who still clung to life despite having its head mostly severed, was too distracted to notice his departure. Fortunately, the system took that into account, because the second he was out of view, he felt essence of the wolf increase his movement speed, which told him that he'd left combat. So he wasted no time before slipping into the guise of the unseen, and returning whence he had come. Neither Calamity nor Swarm were long-lasting spells, but only a few seconds had passed. So the elf and the troll were still very much occupied. The elf had redoubled his efforts at hacking through the troll, clearly hoping that the draining ability could outpace the damage of Elijah's spells. And it was mostly working. However, everything went wrong for the warden when, at last, the troll succumbed to the cascade of damage and passed away. Suddenly, the elf's efforts were for naught. Obviously, his victim needed to be alive to facilitate his draining spell, and it was at that moment that Elijah embraced Predator Strike and pounced. Instead of focusing on harrying attacks as he had against the ogres, Elijah leaped onto the elf's back, latched his powerful jaws onto the nape of his neck, then squeezed. Since the transformation or evolution, perhaps of the predator form, Elijah had spent quite a lot of time examining his physiology. In a lot of ways, it resembled the big cat it had once been, which was why he referred to it as a scaled panther. However, that characterization was a bit of a misnomer, especially when it came to the structure of his head. Most big cats could only muster around 1,000 pounds per square inch of bite force. Even before the form's evolution, Elijah knew he far exceeded that, especially under the effect of Predator Strike. However, he still felt like that was just a multiplier on the limitations of basic physiology. The new scaled panther form had a jaw more like a crocodile, and as such, in that shape, he could bring an absolutely incredible amount of force to bear. With the modifier of Predator Strike working in his favor, that degree of pressure went from incredible to astounding. Elijah knew that. He had come to rely on it. And yet, he was still surprised when the elf's head popped like a grape. The warden fell, collapsing into a boneless heap atop the troll it had worked so hard to kill. Elijah leaped free, shocked at how easily the elf had died. He'd been gearing up for a long, epic battle where he had to dart back and forth, and wear the warden down. And what he'd gotten was a sudden and somewhat anticlimactic end. Not that he was complaining. And after a few moments, he saw evidence of why the elf had succumbed so quickly, when he noticed the dark tendrils tracing a spiderweb of discoloration up what was left of its neck. Clearly, the affliction of Swarm had weakened him. Calamity had contributed as well. Though Elijah had only intended the two spells as distractions, they were obviously more powerful than he'd expected them to be. After letting out a hiss of relief, Elijah embraced guise of the unseen once again, and turned to see if there were any other threats. He'd already accounted for everyone in the dungeon, but there was nothing to say that they couldn't get reinforcements from the citadel above. When nothing came for another 5 minutes, he finally let himself relax. He'd sustained no damage since using Guardian's renewal, so he was still in perfect health. Still, he switched back to his caster form and spent some time in meditation so he could regain his spent Ethera. When that was done, he set about looting the ogres as well as the warden. The ogre guards had very little Elijah could take with him. Their armor and weapons were far too bulky, and they'd carried nothing but a couple of copper Ethereum in their belt pouches. He collected what loot he could, then turned his attention to the elf. Fortunately, the sword fit in his pack, though try as he might, he couldn't remove the warden's armor. It was almost as if it was part of the elf's body. So, after spending far longer than he probably should have trying to pry it loose, he marked it up as a lost cause. However, he did retrieve another set of keys that he hoped would come in handy going forward. He also looted a pair of silver Ethereum, which he added to his collection. With that, he felt that he was finished with the floor, especially considering that he'd finally accomplished the task. However, before he advanced and retrieved what he hoped would be a useful reward, he had to take care of something important. The kill energy or experience, which was a gaming term the people back in Norcastle had used, had pushed him over the edge and into level 35. And with that level, he had finally gotten his first spell in quite some time. As he looked at the resulting notification, he couldn't help but smile at the achievement. The smell of death and decay hung heavy in the air as Elijah crouched in the cell where he'd defeated the warden. The corpses of the troll, dark elf, and ogres were a long way from decomposition, but to Elijah, they still smelled of rot. Perhaps that was just his imagination. Or given the things he'd seen in the other cells, maybe not. Either way, he was eager to leave it all behind for more pleasant environs. However, before he could do that, he had a few tasks before him. The first concerned the fact that, by virtue of killing the warden, and the troll he'd temporarily saved, he'd finally reached level 35. And that advancement had come with a host of advantages. As always, he'd gained another point in each of his attributes, enhancing his already impressive status further past the human standard. Name: Elijah Hart. Level: 35. Archetype: Druid. Class: Animist. Specialization: Not applicable. Alignment: Not applicable. Strength: 36. Dexterity: 45/35. Constitution: 46/36. Ethera: 44. Regeneration: 58/38. Attunement: Nature. Cultivation stage, cultivator. Body: core. Mind: soul. Wood: hatchling. Quartz: neophyte. Of course, his attributes didn't tell the full story of his advancement. Due to both one with nature and his cultivation, his attributes all meant much more than the numbers might suggest. He still wasn't certain exactly how much those factors affected him, but he knew that it was significant. And if he managed to advance the rest of his cultivation, the gap between his apparent and effective attributes would only grow wider. However, to his annoyance, he still wasn't entirely sure how to go about furthering his cultivation. He'd tried variations on the methods he'd used to take the first step in each category, but those had so far yielded no results. He supposed he just needed to keep at it, and maybe he would unlock the secret. But in the back of his mind, he hoped that, eventually, Nerthus would be able to tell him more. Or perhaps he could purchase a guide from a more advanced branch of the world tree. Either way, he suspected that continuing to progress his cultivation would be a difficult road. If it was easy, then everyone would have done it. And though he couldn't be certain, he didn't think anyone in Ironshore had made strides in that department, supporting the notion that it would take more than a few lucky guesses to break through to the next cultivation stages. Still, there was hope. After all, he'd already reached the second stage in the cultivation of his mind. That was proof that he could do the same with the other components of cultivation. Even so, his attributes were still progressing nicely, especially when he was under the influence of his various enhancements. He shuddered to think of where he would be without them. Dead, he muttered to himself. I would be dead. Ironically, the enhancement that had probably served him best during battle didn't even show up in his status. Essence of the Wolf had proven itself a vital component of his toolkit on so many occasions that he knew that, without a shadow of a doubt, he would have died dozens of times over without it. Not only did it increase his movement speed, which was incredibly valuable, as he'd proven in the primordial maze as well as many other times since then, but it also gave him an easily understood indicator of when he entered and dropped out of combat. That was precisely the information he needed in order to properly time the use of Guise of the Unseen. For what felt like the 1000th time, he found himself grateful that he'd been granted the Druid archetype. Otherwise, there was no way he would have survived even a few weeks on the island, much less everything that had happened since then. 2.5 years. At times, it certainly didn't seem like it had been that long. But at others it felt like an eternity had passed since he'd been on a plane and dying of cancer. He wasn't just a different person now. He felt like an entirely different species. However, it was at times like these that he found himself glancing at the power ladder and wondering about his family. Carmen's name was still on there, giving him comfort. Sure, he knew that Carmen Rodriguez wasn't a terribly uncommon name. There were probably thousands of women bearing that moniker. But Elijah knew in his gut that the one on the ladder was his sister-in-law. Or maybe it's all just wishful thinking, he acknowledged aloud. After all, he needed to believe that Alyssa and Miguel were okay, and clinging to the notion of Carmen's survival as an indicator that they were still alive satisfied that need in a way no self-assurance could. It was something tangible that he could point to as evidence, and until he discovered otherwise, he would choose to believe that everyone he loved was still out there living their lives in the transformed world. A pretty fantasy, perhaps, but it was one he needed to believe. Idly, he wondered if they'd thought the same thing when seeing his name. Maybe they'd thrown a party when he'd popped onto the ladder. Or perhaps they hadn't noticed at all. Surely they had their own problems to deal with, and Elijah was well aware that everyone wouldn't be quite as obsessed with that ladder as he'd become. Whatever the case, he couldn't afford to dwell on it. Instead, he had a tower to conquer, and before he did that, he needed to examine his latest spell. Spell. Shield of Brambles. Shelter beneath nature's embrace, protecting yourself and damaging any who attack you. The description was a little ambiguous for Elijah's taste, but he could sense a few things about the spell. First, it was an enhancement not unlike Essence of the Boar or Monkey, meaning that it would take up one of his 3 slots. That alone soured him on it a little. He liked his extra attributes, and now that he could use all the relevant spells to enhance them, he was loath to give them up. Second, he could sense that there were 2 benefits to the spell. For one, it would shield him from some degree of damage. How much was yet to be seen, but any extra protection would be welcome. He hadn't forgotten how easily that magical sword had slid through his scales, after all. And that had been in his guardian form, which increased his constitution by a fair amount. He didn't want to think about the damage it would have done if he'd been in his human form. So he couldn't dismiss the spell altogether, especially when it had a secondary function, which would somehow inflict damage on anyone who attacked him. He had no idea what form that would take or how severely it would injure his attackers, and the only way he was going to find out was to test it. So without further ado, Elijah cancelled Essence of the Monkey, then cast Shield of Brambles. As he did so, he looked at his arm, and what he saw was simultaneously awe-inspiring as well as troubling. His skin turned slightly green, taking on the texture of bark. At the same time, tiny thorns maybe a quarter of an inch long sprouted all over his body. Strangely enough, they positioned themselves atop his clothes, which made for an odd sight. Extending his index finger to one of the thorns, he was disappointed to find that it passed right through the protrusion. But then again, that shouldn't have been terribly surprising. The spell's description had specified that it only damaged those who attacked him, so it stood to reason that it would only become material in that event. Which was more than a little frustrating. In a tower, he didn't have much chance to test a new ability. The margins for error were so thin that he just couldn't afford to use a suboptimal enhancement. Perhaps that would change. Maybe he would find a good opportunity to find its limitations. But for now, he would keep going with the same approach he'd used since the beginning of the tower. So he cancelled Shield of Brambles, then reapplied Essence of the Monkey. After ensuring that his other enhancements were active, he took the opportunity to explore the rest of the dungeon, paying close attention to the torture room. The giant goblin was exactly where Elijah had last seen it, which was to say that it was hanging from a torture rack, but it had already surrendered to death. The room itself was a grotesquerie of torture equipment. Hooks, knives, and various other tools abounded. There was even something that looked suspiciously like an Iron Maiden in the corner. Despite the fact that some of the implements had the potential of being somewhat useful, Elijah declined to take them with him. He told himself that they were all too bulky, and that they would take up too much room in his pack. But in the back of his mind, he knew the real reason lay in their intended purpose. However, he did find a small chest containing a few gems, a handful of Ethereum, both copper and silver, and a shiny dagger with a ruby embedded in the pommel. Like the sword he'd taken from the warden, it felt magical, though Elijah had no idea what form that magic might take. Perhaps he could get one of those tablets that Mari, the tailor back in Ironshore, had used to inspect his staff. She'd said something about it utilizing her techniques, so he suspected he wouldn't be able to use it. Either way, he hoped to find someone who could help him out by identifying the weapons he'd looted. Maybe he could even sell them for a decent number of coins. He wasn't hurting for money or anything, but he'd seen the price of some of those guides. More, he wanted to be in position to buy things he might need in the future, and from his experience, one could never have enough money. That was true in the old world, and he suspected it would be the same moving forward. In any case, he finished his perusal of whatever the torture room had to offer, then left it behind as quickly as possible. Soon enough, he found himself standing before the gate leading up to the citadel above. He had no idea what to expect up there, but he knew it would tax his abilities. So he took a deep breath, then used one of the keys from the warden's keychain to unlock the gate. It swung open with an ominous creak, but as horror movie-esque as the sound was, nothing jumped out at him. Now that the need for thumbs had been obviated, he replaced the keychain in his pack, took his staff in hand, and shifted into the shape of the predator. Then, after embracing guise of the unseen, he padded forward. The moment he passed through the gate, he felt himself shift slightly. It only lasted an instant, and when it passed, the stairwell beyond the gate looked no different than it had from the other side. Yet, he knew that he'd passed into the next level of the tower. Hammering that home was a simple, silver box that had suddenly appeared before him. Almost as soon as he noticed his reward for defeating the previous floor, a notification flashed before his eyes. Congratulations! You have completed level 1 of Reaver Citadel. Grade B. To progress further, complete the task before you and reach the throne room. His grade was a little disappointing, especially after he'd gone to such lengths to complete the optional task. However, when he thought about it, Elijah could guess why he hadn't gotten full marks. After all, he'd only killed a few of the monsters himself. That had to have counted against him. In any case, he moved on to the next notification that appeared before his inner eye. Task: defeat the 5 lieutenants. That certainly didn't sound promising. If the 5 lieutenants were anything like the warden, he had his work cut out for him. And this time, he didn't think he'd have the benefit of a semi-friendly troll to act as a distraction. Still, he'd gotten this far, and he had to believe he had what it took to conquer the tower. Hopefully, his reward would help with that. So he quickly shifted back to human form, then bent down and unlatched the small chest. Inside was a simple red strip of cloth. Reward for completing level 1 of Reaver Citadel. Sash of the Whirlwind. Elijah reached in and retrieved the strip of cloth. It was a little more than 3 feet long, so it could easily wrap it around his slim waist. But when he put it on, tying it in place, he immediately felt the item's effect. A wide smile spread across his face. He couldn't deny the utility of his previous rewards. The Ring of Anonymity and the Ring of Aquatic Travel had both served him well enough. Though, by his own admission, the latter had proved far more useful than the former so far. The jury was still out on the shard of the world tree he'd given to Nerthus, but given the tree spirit's reaction, it was probably the most valuable of his rewards. However, based on his initial impressions, the Sash of the Whirlwind would be even more immediately impactful. After Elijah tied the sash of the whirlwind around his waist, he looked at his status. What he saw was incredible, a boost of 3 points to both strength and dexterity, but what he felt was even more impressive. It was difficult to explain, but he felt faster and more energetic than even that small boost would have suggested. Indeed, the effect was so prominent that he felt almost as if the world was moving just a little bit slower than normal. His Predator and Guardian forms both came with significant attribute boosts, so he knew very well what those felt like. This was something entirely different, and unless he missed his guess, it would prove to be life-altering, at least in terms of his combat ability. Once again, he cursed his inability to inspect his items. Sure, he knew the name, but unlike had been the case with the Ring of Anonymity and the Ring of Aquatic Travel, the label did nothing to hint at its purpose. Even so, if that influx of speed that he felt was any indication, the name still felt appropriate enough. For a few minutes, Elijah practiced moving with the new sash, but he quickly tired of the game. He wouldn't be able to properly test it until he found some enemies. So, with that in mind, he once again shifted into his scaled panther form and set off up the moldy stairs and into the darkness beyond. With one with nature, he could feel most of his surroundings, but even so, he kept his every sense trained on his immediate vicinity. Like that, he crested the first flight of stairs and reached a small rectangular platform. There was nothing there, so Elijah quickly mounted the set of stairs leading up and in the direction he'd just come. Soon enough, he found another switchback. Then another until, finally, he reached a thick, wooden door banded with black iron. Stepping close, he tried to extend his senses to the room beyond, but he felt nothing past the door. So he adopted his human form, then retrieved the warden's keyring from where he'd stashed it in his pack. After that, it only took a few tries to find the proper key, which he used to unlock the door. Then, he pushed it open to reveal a dark room filled with crates and barrels. He stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. The moment it did, Elijah felt 1,000 presences flare to life around him. One with nature didn't tell him much about what they were, but he could feel their long, fat, and furry bodies. More importantly, he sensed that they were aggressive, and that they'd targeted him as their potential prey. Without hesitation, Elijah preemptively cast Healing Rain, then cancelled Essence of the Monkey before using Shield of Brambles. Finally, he cast Shape of the Guardian. Shape of the Predator was great for dealing damage, but with the size of the horde bearing down on him, Elijah knew he couldn't avoid taking damage himself. For that, the scaled ape form was far superior. Discarding Essence of the Monkey in favor of Shield of Brambles followed a similar logic. A few extra points of dexterity weren't going to help him very much in his current situation, but a little extra mitigation, and whatever reflective damage came with the spell would be far more useful. In fact, it was just such an occasion, an onslaught of smaller, numerous enemies, for which he'd preemptively decided to use Shield of Brambles. It was just a twist of fate that it had come so quickly after he'd gotten the spell. Or maybe not. The towers were curated, after all, so there was a good chance that it had somehow noticed the acquisition of the spell and given him a perfect chance to use it. Elijah had no idea, and he was in no position to ponder a question to which he didn't think he'd ever get an answer. Even as those thoughts crossed his mind, his transformation into a scaled ape completed, and just in time for him to meet his opponents. The first one launched itself high into the air, clearly with the intention of clawing out his eyes. However, with the seeming time dilation afforded by his new sash of the whirlwind, Elijah saw it coming from a mile away. Still, his foresight was only enough to allow him to turn his head before the furry bullet hit him in the side of the head. Elijah's scales protected him from the thing's sharp teeth, but the sheer force of its impact sent him stumbling. The rodent, and it was definitely a foot-long rat, bulging with muscle, wasn't so lucky. The second it hit him, a giant thorn ejected from Elijah's scales, piercing it through the chest. It only went about an inch deep before breaking off, but that was more than enough to send the little monster to screeching in pain as it fell to the stone floor. A quick but vicious stomp ended that, and he felt the monster's bones crunching underfoot. He also felt its innards oozing between his talons, but thankfully, he didn't have any time to think about that before another little rodent hit him. Then another. Dozens came, all at once, but they met the same end as the first. Pierced through by thorns, they all fell to the floor, where Elijah stomped them to death. None of them were particularly dangerous. Not individually. However, that was mostly because they only got one bite in. However, Elijah knew that, without the extra armor provided by Shield of Brambles or his enhanced constitution, he never could have withstood the onslaught. Even with all of his advantages and in his scaled ape form, he was almost perfectly suited for that kind of battle that was still an incredibly painful fight. The rodents were equipped with sharp teeth as well as enhanced strength, so, while they had trouble getting all the way through his scales, their bites were still anything but comfortable. But as always, Elijah endured. The small wounds they did manage to inflict were healed quickly enough by healing rain, so he was never in much danger. That would have changed had he been in his human or scaled panther forms, though. It wasn't difficult to imagine being ripped to shreds under that barrage of sharp teeth and claws. Even in his guardian form, the fight would have gone very differently if Shield of Brambles hadn't proved its worth by incapacitating the little beasts. By the time he squished the last one underfoot, Elijah had long since lost track of how many he'd killed. Hundreds, surely, though he didn't think the number exceeded 1,000. Regardless, he slew so many that he actually gained another level, putting him at 36. With that last monster dead, he let his shoulders sag in relief and fatigue. He hadn't really had to put forth much effort. He wasn't that tired either. However, there was just something about being constantly nibbled to death that brought with it an exhaustion all its own. Yet, he couldn't allow himself to rest for more than a couple of minutes before he moved on, exploring the room in which he'd found himself. Remaining in his scaled ape form, Elijah loped from one end of the room to the other, surmising that it was a cellar of sorts. He did discover that the crates were filled with foodstuffs, mostly moldy bread, and bits of dried meat, and the barrels contained some foul-smelling liquid he took to be beer of a sort. He didn't taste it, though, so he couldn't be certain. Instead, after shifting back to his human form, he retrieved one of his jugs from his pack and drank deeply before satisfying his hunger by dipping into his own travel rations. They were mostly tasteless, but he did savor one of the berries he'd brought from his grove. After almost 2 months of travel, he didn't have many left, so he'd resolved to eat them sparingly. The tart flavor reminded him of home, though, and more than ever, Elijah found himself missing his grove. Certainly, his thirst for adventure hadn't faded, but he couldn't deny that he also craved the comforts and safety of home. Once he'd satisfied his hunger and slaked his thirst, Elijah rose from his haunches and headed toward a stairway he'd found during his previous examination of the room. It was short, ending in a pair of doors embedded in the roof, confirming his deduction that he was in a cellar. However, that presented a problem in that he was quite sure that, on the other side of those doors were enemies. And not the sort he could kill as easily as the rat swarm. Mentally preparing himself to respond to any threats, Elijah took a deep breath, then reached out to unlatch the doors before pushing one open. He poked his head out just enough to see the confines of a broad, empty hallway before scrambling through. After slowly letting the door close behind him, Elijah shifted into the shape of the predator, then adopted guise of the unseen before stepping into a deep shadow near the wall. It was just in time, too, because only a few seconds later, he heard the heavy tramp of boots and the clinking sound of metal clashing against metal coming down the hallway. A moment later, another ogre, this one clad in black armor, appeared. He already had his weapon out, but he'd nonchalantly let the massive broadsword rest on his shoulder as he marched down the spacious hall. Elijah didn't dare move a muscle as he hid in the shadow of what he now recognized as a tall, narrow statue depicting another dark elf. This one had the same elven features that the warden had possessed, but he wore an imperious scowl. Instinctively, Elijah knew that this elf was likely the final foe he'd have to defeat if he wanted to conquer the tower. First, though, he needed to defeat 5 lieutenants. To that end, he waited holding his breath the whole time, as the enormous ogre stomped down the hall. Guise of the unseen had proven itself hundreds of times, and he trusted the ability implicitly. However, the close proximity of the gargantuan and deadly ogre was enough to send his heart to beating out of his chest. Yet the ability remained just as effective as ever, because the ogre never even glanced in his direction. Still, Elijah didn't relax until it turned a corner, and was out of sight for more than 30 seconds. For a few more seconds after that, he remained still as he let his heart rate normalize. When it did, he took another deep, hissing breath, then padded forward on silent feet. Staying low to the ground, he practically slithered to the end of the hall, then peeked around the corner. The coast was clear, so he continued on. As Elijah progressed, he studied his surroundings with a keen eye. The structure itself was much the same as he'd encountered below. Just unadorned stone walls, without much in the way of decoration. However, it was free of the algae that pervaded the sewer and dungeon, which told him that the denizens at least understood the value of cleanliness. Every so often, he'd pass by a tapestry depicting ogres in battle. The style was extremely primitive, but it was easy enough to make out the subjects. Then there were the statues, each one representing the same dark elf. Some had him standing stoic guard, a giant sword with its tip planted into the ground. Others showed him in the middle of battle, sword raised high, and with a snarl on his sharp-featured face. It was a not-so-subtle hint of what was to come. Finally, after spending quite some time wandering the halls, and seeing more than a dozen ogre guards along the way, Elijah found an unlocked door. It wasn't the first he'd encountered, but it was the only one that was occupied. He crept through the door, seeing a tall, gangly man sitting behind a desk with his head in his hands. Elijah slipped around the edge of the room, preparing himself to attack. He used Predator Strike, then Venom Strike for good measure. However, just before he pounced, he noticed the heavy shackles on the man's ankles. From those iron cuffs stretched a pair of thick chains leashing him to a couple of rings beneath the desk. That's when Elijah stopped to really study the man. He was bald, and his skin held a waxy sheen. Upon his body were a collection of rags, dirty, dusty, and frayed. But more than anything, Elijah noticed that the man was weeping. He was a prisoner, just like the troll had been. For a moment, Elijah considered attacking anyway, but he discarded that notion as disgusting. The man was clearly human, and the idea of killing an unarmed and helpless man crossed almost all of Elijah's lines. On top of that, he didn't sense that the prisoner was very powerful, so he wouldn't even get much experience for it. So there was little to gain from killing the man, which gave Elijah two choices. 1, he could simply leave the prisoner behind. Or 2, he could free the man and use him as a source of information. The former was, on the surface, the smarter option. There were a ton of ways freeing the prisoner could backfire, and Elijah wasn't so certain of his own strength that he wanted to make the task before him more difficult. However, the second was appealing as well. The possibility of gaining the upper hand through information was enticing, all on its own. Ultimately, though, the decision came down to one thing. Elijah knew that towers were structured very deliberately. The presence of the prisoner was important, and he suspected that freeing the man would prove, if not necessary, then important going forward. That was enough to push Elijah into the second option. So, without further hesitation, Elijah backed away, just out of reach of the man's chains, then let his predator form fall away. With it went Guise of the Unseen, exposing him completely. However, the prisoner was too engrossed in his own misery to even notice the sudden appearance of another human being. Elijah cast Healing Rain, which encompassed the entire room. Then, even as the first drops fell and the man looked up, he said, "Hello. I'm Elijah. You look like you could use some help." The prisoner looked up with heavy-lidded eyes, his face creased from advanced age, and locked his gaze onto Elijah. He opened his mouth as if to speak, revealing a mouth devoid of teeth, then let out a rasping cackle that quickly turned into a coughing fit. Elijah's instincts told him to step in, to offer comfort to the elderly man, but he pushed that urge aside. Looks, he knew, could be deceptive, and he had no idea what capabilities the old prisoner possessed. "Help," the man croaked, disbelief evident in his rough voice. "There is no help. Only the sweet release of death. Will you deliver me, stranger?" "I am willing. I will not resist." His chains clinked as he held his hands out in submission, but still, Elijah was wary. So he asked, "Do you know that you're in a tower?" "Tower? No. That is impossible. I remember, oh, goddess and her empire, I remember the reavers descending upon my village. They took us all. I resisted. I tried to save them. But I was powerless. I lived, even when I should have died. There is no one else left. Just me." Elijah considered the cost of the man's endurance. His ordeal had clearly robbed him of the necessary faculties to see the truth of his circumstances. Briefly, Elijah wondered what that meant for when this fragment of his soul returned to the host, if it ever would, but he couldn't afford to ponder such things. Every moment he spent without the shelter of guise of the unseen was another opportunity for his enemies to find him. So as much as he wanted to help the old man see the truth, he simply didn't have the time nor the opportunity. So he moved on, asking, "Why did they spare you? What do you do in here?" The man had already begun to babble about empires, curses, and goddesses, so Elijah had to snap his fingers in front his face before he looked up. When he did, no recognition was apparent on his face. Clearly, the elderly man's mind was gone. Deciding to use a familiar tactic, Elijah unslung his pack and retrieved a jug of water. He took a drink, then handed it over. "Drink. It's safe," he prompted. The old man didn't need any more prodding, and an instant later, he was sputtering under the onslaught of water as he tried to drink too much at once. Yet, the fact that he spilled more than actually went down his throat didn't seem to deter him one bit. Finally, after emptying the entire jug, the man seemed to remember that Elijah was there, and he narrowed his eyes, asking, "Who are you?" "My name is Elijah." "Why are you here?" "I think you know," Elijah guessed. When the old man didn't offer a response, Elijah went on, "I'm here to kill the lieutenants, and then the reaver." Once again, the elderly man's eyes narrowed to slits. Suddenly, he burst into laughter that soon became another coughing fit. This time, Elijah had no trouble ignoring his own helpful nature as the old man muttered, "Kill the reaver," as if, "Ha! Are you finished? Because if you keep going on like this, the ogres are probably going to come investigate." "I'm pretty sure I can take at least a couple of them," Elijah lied. "But you? They'll smash you to bits. Maybe that's what you want. I don't know. But I need your help. A lot of people depend on my success. I did that once," the man mused. "Tried to take it all on my shoulders. I couldn't bear the weight. And I don't remember much more than that. Isn't that odd?" "That's because you're in a tower." "Not possible. If this were a tower, and you were a challenger, you would not be alone," he said. Elijah shrugged. "Maybe I do things a little differently. It doesn't matter, though. Look, these ogres imprisoned you, right? They killed people you cared about, didn't they? Don't you want revenge?" "Of course." "Then help me," Elijah urgently insisted. "Give me information, and maybe I can make them pay for what they did to you. I could even save you. I am beyond saving, and there is no possibility of your success. No, better to just give in and beg for a quick death. No suffering. I'll risk it. Tell me about the lieutenants." "Monsters, all. Tuck and Talk are mages, masters of fire and ice, and their domains reflect their chosen elements," the old man stated. "Domains? They have domains?" That got the prisoner's attention. "No. The wings of the citadel in which they live and work. Not true domains." "I am surprised you know of such things," he said. "Where did you hear of them?" "Here or there," Elijah answered, already filing away the information. "What about the others?" It didn't get any better from there. Now that the old man was talking, he was more than willing to give Elijah all the information he could desire. Each lieutenant commanded a separate wing of the citadel. To the north was Tuck, with his fire. Talk, who was apparently Tuck's twin brother, commanded Frost to the south. Meanwhile, to the east was a dark elf named Tulariel, who held dominion over shadow. A high elf named Avisil, who was a master of light, was to the west. Finally, on the next floor up was a domineering ogre who was supposedly the strongest warrior the citadel had to offer. He was known only as the champion. The ogre warrior guarded the way to the Reaver, who was almost assuredly the final obstacle to conquering the tower. So, even if Elijah found a way to bypass his task to slay the other lieutenants, he would still have to defeat the champion. Once the old man had finished his explanation, which Elijah was convinced was the whole reason he existed within the tower, he said, "Now that I've answered your questions, I have a request for you. I don't think the keys I stole will work on those. Kill me." What? Please. Kill me. If it is a tower, then I will be that much closer to having fulfilled my purpose. One day, I will be freed to rejoin myself in the outside world, and I will be all the richer for it. But if it is not a tower, I do not wish to live another day. It is too painful, physically and emotionally. Please, I would do it myself, but... He pulled the chains taut, showing that he only had a few extra inches of movement. Why do they keep you here? Elijah asked. I translate texts, the man said. The Reaver is something of a student of the occult. From time to time, she descends from her perch and requests a translation of some obscure text. Yet another reason I must die. Those books, nothing good can come of them. Fell rituals, soul magic, and demonic pacts. You mustn't. Real demons. As in the elder race. He gave a rasping chuckle. No. Someone like her, as powerful as she is compared to the likes of us, could never command one of the elders, the man said. She makes pacts with beings from Ethera, the Underrealm. They use that pact as a tether to allow them to traverse the world tree and enter this realm. Elijah told the old man that he didn't understand. To that, the prisoner simply shook his head and said, the universe you know, the one in which we live, is called Mort Alam. Above is Purina, the ice fortress, Silvara, the wilderness, and Azira, also called the realm of sky. Below us is Ignis, Nilfara, the Umbra, and the Ethereum. And below even that is the Underrealm, located in the roots of the world tree. It is there from which the Reaver's demons hail. They are alien creatures with fell powers of corruption, and they can only pass into this realm by virtue of an invitation. The pacts you mentioned, Elijah reasoned. It didn't take a genius to make that connection. The old man nodded. You will likely never see the other planes, he said. Few natives of Mort Alam do. To even survive, you must become an ascendant at the very least, though even then, it is dangerous to the extreme. Not that going to the other planes is ever safe. Even for demigods. What about deities and transcendence? The man snorted. What do I know about those lofty existences, he asked, a little more personality showing through. Was he getting comfortable? Or was it a ruse to get Elijah to do what he wanted? Probably more than me, Elijah admitted deprecatingly. The old man snorted again, but he didn't extend the conversation. A few seconds passed before he asked, so, will you do it? Suddenly, Elijah was reminded that it wouldn't be his first experience with mercy killing. Not only had he done so while hunting with his father throughout his childhood, but more memorably, he'd killed the panther guardian he'd been incapable of saving. More than once, he'd replayed those events in his mind, and he knew precisely how many mistakes he'd made that day. But this was different. He could save the old man. With a few casts of touch of nature, Elijah could heal him. Then, he could find some way to free the prisoner from those shackles. He was smart. Resourceful. He could figure it out. Don't. What? Asked Elijah. You can't free me. Why? I've done. If you do, I will kill you, the old man said in a low voice. When he looked up and saw Elijah's puzzled expression, he went on, oh, this is not the real me. It is, but these chains, they weaken me. Drain my Ethera until there's nothing left. Freed, I would recover and the beast would take over. What beast? One of those demons we were talking about, he said. I was one of her first experiments. Her first sacrifice. She offered me up, and with these chains, I was incapable of resisting. The stupid creature never expected to take over a bound body, though. It was restricted and drained, just as I was. She lets it out from time to time, using it to translate demonic rituals. If it was at full strength, I would not be aware during those periods. But now, I know everything it does. I know how it thinks. I know its cravings as my own. The moment these chains are removed, it will take over, and it will wreak havoc on this entire citadel. I am already dead. Finishing the job will be a mercy. It cannot survive without me to anchor it to this plane. While listening, Elijah had felt his heart sink. He knew what he had to do. Certainly, the old man could be lying. But it didn't seem likely. Besides, Elijah kept reminding himself that killing the moon wouldn't be permanent. He was just a sliver of a soul borrowed by the system, and thrust into the tower so as to give it authenticity. Or variety. Regardless of the reason, it didn't really matter. The fact was that there was no good reason for Elijah to refuse the man's request. And there were plenty of reasons to do it. Except it felt wrong in ways logic and reasoning couldn't touch. For all his life, Elijah had been told killing another person was wrong. So, even with the mitigating factors of the situation, he couldn't help but hesitate. Sure, he had killed, and often. All those gnomes, goblins, and dwarves had fallen by his hand, and that wasn't even considering the things he'd done in the tower. Yet, there was something entirely different about those, and Elijah was at least honest enough with himself to admit that it was based on the fact that they weren't human. He closed his eyes and took in a deep breath. When he opened them, he was resolved to do what was necessary. So he said, I need you to close your eyes. The old man looked a little surprised at the request, but then nodded, saying, I understand. When his eyelids fell, Elijah used shape of the predator to adopt the scaled panther form. Then, because the old man's eyes were closed, it only took a few seconds for him to slip out of combat. The moment he did, he let guise of the unseen envelop him. Thus cloaked in the stealth ability, he activated Predator Strike. He padded into position, his feet silent. The old man clearly didn't hear him. He had no idea what was coming. Once Elijah was behind the man, he cocked his claw back, then swiped across the old prisoner's neck. The blow, which was augmented by Predator Strike, hit so swiftly and with such force that it decapitated the old man. Even as the prisoner's head fell free, Elijah felt a tiny trickle of experience, telling him that the man was dead. He let out a reptilian sigh, then noticed that the shackles had unlatched the moment the man died. Seeing that, Elijah wasted no time before gathering the chains, then shifting back to his human form, so he could stow them away in his pack. With that done, he waited a few moments to let his Ethera regenerate, then shifted back into his scaled panther form before once again adopting the guise of the unseen. Without another look back, he padded out into the hall and continued on his way. Still, even if he didn't look back, he would never forget the sight of that old man's headless body. Roman stood on the balcony, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared at the horizon. Below him, the city of Easton spread out for more than a mile. The old wall had been dismantled, and the area surrounding his palace, the former police station, had been meticulously redesigned. The architects, builders, and sculptors had only had time to implement the new plans in an area of about 2 square blocks, but they covered more ground by the day. It truly is amazing how quickly people can work with these new classes, he remarked, careful to measure his words. With his position, he needed to maintain a certain aura of authority, and speaking like a small-town police chief was no longer appropriate. Instead, he struggled to channel a more imperious personality even when he wasn't in public. He turned to Fiona, the mage who had become his closest advisor, and asked, how long until they complete the royal district? The mouse woman's expression didn't change as she answered, Victor claims that it will be complete at the end of next month. And the new wall? Asked Roman, squinting into the distance. The wall in question was located 2 miles away, but even from such a distance, it wasn't difficult to see. Roman had approved the plans himself, but it was still hard to believe such a thing was possible. Little more than the foundations had been completed, but when the wall was finished, it would stretch almost 300 feet into the air and encircle the entire city. Even the outskirts. That will take longer, Fiona answered. 6 months. Perhaps a year. Unacceptable. Fiona said, we're pushing them, but the arcane researchers all agree that. Roman's glare was enough to send her sputtering to make excuses, and each one angered him even more. His knuckles whitened as his fists tightened, but he refused to shout. He was better than that. He needed to be steady. Strong. Immovable. Otherwise, he couldn't be a proper leader. So he listened as Fiona haltingly explained how the complexity of the wall's intended enchantments were slowing down its construction. The true issue was that he was dependent on a bunch of scholars. Ever since Earth had felt the touch of the World Tree, their mere existence had been a thorn in his side. In the beginning, his annoyance with their archetype choice was born of simple practicality. When they lived in a world where every day was a struggle to survive, fighters and crafters were exponentially more useful than someone whose skills began and ended with the ability to remember things really well. That was an intentional oversimplification, but the fact remained that Roman regarded anyone who chose the path of a scholar as, at best, selfish. At worst, they were cowards. Most of them were idealistic idiots who refused to accept that the world had irrevocably changed, and that their priorities should shift as well. Even if it was uncomfortable. Even if it meant they'd have to do the sorts of things they often regarded as barbaric or beneath them. Of course, Roman was no idiot. He understood the value such people could bring to a society. However, he also knew that, when food and security were in such short supply, scholars and researchers were a luxury they couldn't afford to indulge. So he'd made a lot of difficult choices. He'd indirectly killed thousands by refusing scholars entry into Easton. Each one of those deaths weighed heavily on his shoulders, but that was what leadership often was, choosing between a collection of terrible options. And now, the price of those choices had come due. It had been months since he'd rescinded the moratorium on allowing new arrivals with scholar archetypes into the city, and though the population of dedicated academics had grown significantly, few exceptional people had emerged. Some of his advisors had pointed out that some of that was due to the city's reputation. The world was disjointed and disconnected, but there was enough trade between Easton and a few other towns and cities that word of their discriminatory practices against scholars had spread. Because of that, very few of those people even tried to enter the city anymore, opting for more accepting environments. As a result, Easton's advancement had suffered, though Roman had some ideas on how to solve that problem. He only needed a little more time before he could implement those plans. In the meantime, they were forced to work with the tools they had on hand, which meant that development on a project like the wall was slow. Still, Roman hoped it would be worth it, especially considering the resources they'd put into it. He'd lost count of how many Ethereum they'd spent, not to mention the physical cost of all the labor that had gone into it to get even this far. And the price would only become more exorbitant before the project was completed. It will be worth it, sir, said Fiona. She was his right-hand woman, and as such, she knew him better than anyone else in Easton. Especially since Alyssa had met with her unavoidable fate. When the wall is finished, we won't have to worry about spontaneous vox manifestations anymore. Not to mention that it will keep out the monsters. Indeed, even though the second was the traditional purpose of a wall, especially one as formidable as what they were building, the first benefit was the most important. Every week, Roman read reports about those spontaneous manifestations. Voxian monsters suddenly appearing in people's homes, in businesses, and even in public squares. The city's guardsmen dealt with them as quickly as possible, but rare was the instance where one of the Vox was killed without taking at least a couple of citizens with it. I know. That's why I greenlit the project, he said, turning away. Then, he looked at his watch and asked, where is he? He should be here by now. I am, came a voice from nearby. The moment the sound hit Roman's ear, he had his sword out of the sheath at his waist and 3 temporary enhancements singing through his body as the weapon sliced through the air. With supernatural control, he halted the blade's path as it touched Trace's throat. The outlaw didn't flinch. He knew Roman well enough to trust the assassin's control. Roman rewarded that trust by only nicking the man's neck. It was a testament to Roman's passive ability, sharpened blade, that was possible, given Trace's level and constitution. The man's outlaw class was more well-rounded than most, which meant that he could fill a wide variety of roles, though with a trend toward stealth and utility. That meant that, even though he wasn't overpowering, he was dangerous in almost every situation. He'd proven that on many occasions, and if Roman had his way, he'd continue to do so in service of Easton's best interests. Not the welcome I expected, the man said, an air of nonchalance lacing his voice as he pushed the blade away with one finger. He ran that same finger across the tiny cut on his neck, wiping the blood away. Notably, the nick healed only a second later. Some ability at work, Roman knew, and Trace grinned as he added, I thought we were friends. I've told you not to sneak up on me, Roman responded. If you continue to flout my instructions, you might end up having an accident. Trace chuckled. So you keep saying. But then, you keep coming back to me. Some people might consider our relationship a little toxic, he said. Far be it from me to make that kind of judgment, though. Roman sheathed his sword a bit more forcefully than he otherwise might have. It was a high-quality weapon, one of the best available in Easton, but it was still only crude. None of the other weaponsmiths in the city had managed to repeat Carmen's feat of creating a simple-grade item. It wasn't for lack of trying, either. The highest-leveled of the bunch didn't have Carmen's knack, and the ones who had the knack had yet to attain the necessary techniques. And the couple who had both were lazy, unmotivated, or lacked follow-through. It was a good reminder that, by definition, most people were mediocre. Even in a world full of magic and wonder, that would remain true. That, more than anything, made him regret sending Carmen away. However, he knew that she was a ticking time bomb that, if she remained in Easton, would eventually explode. It was only a matter of time before she discovered the truth of what had happened in that tower. He'd taken steps to mitigate the chances that someone would let the cat out of the bag, but Carmen was far too intelligent to ignore the obvious explanation for how Alyssa had died. All it would take would be a stray thought before her suspicions would begin to mount. From there she'd put it all together. Roman was certain of it. So he'd pushed her away from the city in the hopes that the distraction of running the mine would keep her from figuring things out, at least until he was ready to do what was necessary to deal with her. It would have been easier to simply kill her and everyone else who'd been there. However, he hadn't quite reached the point where he'd resort to wanton murder to solve all his problems. Alyssa's death had been necessary. She was too popular. People had already begun to rally behind her. And it was inevitable that, sooner rather than later, they would decide that she'd make for a better leader than Roman. Never mind that he was the only reason Easton had survived. He'd made all the unpopular choices. He had owned the sacrifices necessary for the city to make it through the events that had killed so many others. Without him, people would have starved. Without him making the hard choices, they would have been incapable of defending themselves. They'd have been weighed down by individual freedoms and freeloaders, and they'd have met a similar fate as dozens of other prospective settlements. By comparison, Alyssa had set herself up as the hero. The person who leaped into battle, putting her own safety at risk to ensure the survival of others. She was the knight in shining armor who never had to make any of the unpopular choices. It would have been so much easier if she'd done so out of a desire to undermine him. But Roman knew that wasn't the case. She'd simply acted according to her nature, and she'd never even realized that, whether she wanted it or not, she had set herself against him, at least in the eyes of the people. The fact that she had often and publicly disagreed with him made the entire situation untenable. But if Roman was honest with himself, he knew that at least part of his decision to remove her was based on her failure to protect Trish. Because of Alyssa, his wife was gone, and even more than a year later, he still felt the loss so keenly that, when he was alone, his grief sometimes sent him spiraling into a level of depression he couldn't afford to let anyone else see. Roman bore some responsibility as well. He should have insisted that Trish stay behind. Up until that point, he'd sheltered her as closely as he was able. However, she'd been adamant that she be allowed to do her part, and he had finally acquiesced to her demands. Largely, that decision was based on his trust in Alyssa. She would protect his wife. He'd been so certain of it. And yet, Trish had died, setting Roman on a path that had ended with him ordering the death of his closest friend. His only friend, really. There were plenty of sycophants like Fiona, all scrambling for his approval in a selfish quest for more power and authority. He recognized them for what they were, but he also saw the benefits they could bring. So he tolerated them. However, none could replace Alyssa, who'd always spoken her mind, even when it put her at odds with him. There was value in that, but it also set a dangerous precedent. Opposition could not be allowed. Not yet. If they were divided, the city would fall. Roman knew that as surely as he'd ever known anything. Which brought him to why he'd summoned Trace to the palace. The Mun was uniquely qualified to do the job Roman had in mind. "I have a proposal for you," he said. "No offense, Chief, but I'm not looking to get married," Trace said with the same crooked grin he almost always bore. "Nothing against you. You're great. Very handsome. I'm just not interested in that kind of—" "Take this seriously," Roman interrupted. "The world ended. Magic and monsters exist. If you're taking this seriously, you're doing it wrong." Roman's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword, the threat of which Trace did not miss. He held up his hands, saying, "Fine." Putting on my serious face. "What's up? What do you have for me?" "Like I said, a proposal. An opportunity. I want you to head up a new division of the government," Roman said. "Your focus will be information gathering and, if necessary, quiet removal of threats to the common good." The decision had not been lightly made, but Roman felt confident that he'd made the right choice. Not only did Trace's class suit the role perfectly, but he also had a certain moral flexibility that would almost assuredly prove necessary. Couple that with his connections throughout the city, the men seemed to know every lowlife in Easton, and he became the clear choice. "That sounds an awful lot like a secret police, Chief," Trace said. "Not a great track record for those, historically speaking." Roman didn't dispute that. "I will give you resources," he stated. "You will have top-tier equipment. Good people. Advancement opportunities. And of course, you will be well compensated." Trace grinned. "You had me at well compensated." "That is literally the last thing he said," Fiona pointed out, her first contribution to the conversation. "And the only thing that mattered," Trace pointed out. "Look, I'm a simple man. Pay me what I'm worth and I'll do whatever job you've got in mind." "A true mercenary," Fiona said. "Don't you have any civic pride? Don't you care about the greater good?" "If the money's right, sure. I care about all sorts of things if you pay me enough." "Disgusting. Practical." "Enough," Roman said before the two could further their argument. Then, to Trace, he asked, "You'll take the job?" "I will. And I promise I'll root out all the bad apples." "Every last one," Trace said. "Now, let's talk more about my compensation. I assume there's a bonus for every traitor I find." As Elijah slipped from one shadow to the next, every exhale brought with it a cloud of mist. The temperature had been falling for a while, and with every step, it had grown ever colder until frost decorated the rough columns on either side of the hall. He glanced up at the vaulted ceilings that had become common in this wing of the citadel, and he saw that small icicles had formed. In addition, when he saw one of the armor-clad ogre guards tromping down the hall, he noticed that the giant creature had donned a fur-lined cloak and heavy gloves. Elijah felt none of the cold, though. The moment the temperature had begun to drop, he'd found an abandoned room, where he'd shifted into his human form, and replaced essence of the monkey with ward of the seasons. Spell. Ward of the Seasons. Harness the power of the seasons, increasing resistance to elemental damage, water, earth, fire, air. The effects were immediate, shielding him from the increasingly frigid temperatures and confirming what he'd already suspected. The frigid cold was magical in nature, so the enhancement had worked as an effective counter. That boded well for what he knew he would have to do in order to conquer the tower. Still, Elijah needed to scout things out before he made any firm plans. So he continued on his way, noting the patrol path of the guards along the way. They were pretty well spaced out, which was a great sign, but he didn't want to act upon the strategy slowly forming in his mind. For now, he was only gathering information. Gradually, he passed through the halls. Every now and then, he would find branches, and he dedicated one facet of his quartz mind to keeping track of the layout as he explored the wing. And over time, Elijah noted the pattern, which roughly resembled a series of concentric hexagons with a circular chamber at the center. Each layer was connected by 5 larger halls that spread out from the center like spokes of a wheel. Elijah couldn't enter the room itself, as it was blocked by a thin sheet of ice. He could break through, but doing so would assuredly draw the attention of the large shape, presumably the ice ogre, Tuck he could just barely make out on the other side. He also noted that the ambient Ethera had grown much thicker, as he'd drawn closer to the creature's icy domain. In any case, he couldn't see how to get to the lieutenant without garnering the attention of every ogre in the wing, so he quickly retreated. Elijah remained in that wing long enough to completely map the layout and the pattern of the guards' patrols before he left it behind and headed to the northern section of the citadel. There he found that the corridors followed a similar pattern, though instead of increasing cold, the temperatures quickly rose to sweltering levels. And when Elijah finally reached the lieutenant's chamber, the heat became visible, and the floor beneath his feet grew uncomfortably hot. And given the protection afforded by Ward of the Seasons, that was saying something. Without it, he felt positive that it would have been hot enough to blister, even with his enhanced constitution. However, just like had been the case with the Tuck's domain, visibility into Tuck's chamber was blocked. This time, though, instead of a sheet of ice, a wall of fire obscured his vision. Fortunately, the layout of the wing was identical to the one dedicated to ice, so once Elijah confirmed that, he focused his attention on other things. The guards in the area had eschewed their armor completely, and they wore similar outfits, if a loincloth qualified for that label, as the more rotund jailers back in the dungeon. However, even without the protection the black iron armor provided, they were still formidable foes. Each one was slick with sweat and obviously miserable, though the fact that they weren't burned, even when they passed by the central chamber, was a testament to their inflated constitution attribute. In any case, Elijah noted their patrol paths, then retreated to the milder environment surrounding the old prisoner's corpse. Once there, he commenced planning. The first obstacle was obviously the guards, and each one represented a potentially deadly battle. The troll had struggled with the ones down in the dungeon, but Elijah expected that was largely due to the fact that it had been outnumbered. So he reckoned that if he could get each of the guards alone, it would give him the best opportunity to defeat them. And given that there were 12 such guards in each of the 2 wings along with 5 patrolling his current location, that strategy was probably going to be a lot trickier than it might seem at first glance. Each wing was an expansive maze of corridors, but they weren't so spread out that he could fight a battle without getting the attention of that area's guards. After giving the problem some thought, Elijah came up with a plan he thought would work. However, the viability depended on the relative intelligence of the ogres. If they were smart, there was no chance of it working. But if they were as dim as his experiences had led him to believe, then he had a chance. Without any other options that he could think of, at least Elijah retreated to the cellar, where he took a few minutes to renew the appropriate enhancements before preemptively casting Healing Rain, regenerating his Ethera, and then shifting back into his scaled panther form. After applying Guise of the Unseen, he climbed the steps and positioned himself just outside the cellar. Once there, he crouched in one of the shadows and waited for his first victim. Fortunately, there wasn't much of a delay before the steady clink of armor and the heavy clomp of ogre footsteps announced the imminent arrival of one of the patrolling guards. Soon enough, the hulking creature stepped into view, but Elijah remained completely stationary as he waited on his victim to arrive at the appropriate location. One weighty stomp came after another until, at last, the monster drew even with Elijah's position. That's when he activated Venom Strike and Predator Strike before he pounced, savaging the unsuspecting ogre's right knee. His claws bit deep between armor plates, ripping through meat and ligaments. The guard let out a shout of surprise and tried to wheel around and bring its massive cudgel to bear. By that point, though, Elijah had already darted into the cellar. He didn't descend the steps, though. Instead, he let out a low growl, just loud enough for the ogre to hear. As he crouched there, he knew that he'd reached the moment of truth. If the ogre was smart, he would seek help. If he was as dumb as Elijah hoped, then the guard would follow the trail Elijah had left. He had plans for both scenarios, but he certainly preferred the latter. When it came to enemies, dumb was always better than smart. For a moment, the ogre seemed confused, but then he realized where the growl had originated. Once he did, he wasted no more time before pursuing Elijah into the cellar. Unfortunately, the wound on its leg wasn't nearly as debilitating as Elijah had hoped, so he was caught by surprise by the ogre's rapid arrival. Still, the time dilation effect of his sash of the whirlwind came in handy, allowing him to move just quickly enough to avoid the charging ogre. Even as Elijah bounded away, it became clear that the ogre hadn't counted on the presence of steps. Overbalanced, the guard couldn't halt his momentum before clattering down the stairs and into the cellar. That's when Elijah pounced again, clawing and biting a handful of times in quick succession. He didn't care about doing immediate damage. Instead, he wanted to build up instances of contagion. For that, fast, shallow cuts were the best. And given his advantages, high strength and dexterity, coupled with the effects of his sash of the whirlwind, he was capable of moving extremely quickly. Even so, he very nearly pushed his luck too far, and he was forced to narrowly dodge the recovering ogre's backhanded blow. Elijah raced away, shifting into his caster form before renewing Healing Rain. It drained only a tiny bit of Ethera, but with the extra potency provided by his dragon core, it could potentially save his life. So he preferred to keep it active during every fight he could. Once that was done, he turned his attention to the ogre and saw that he'd nearly recovered his feet. Elijah pushed Ethera from his core, through his soul, and into snaring roots. Thick vines erupted from the ground, tangling the ogre's massive feet. It tried to rip free, and it succeeded in tearing through the first wave of roots. However, they were quickly replaced by more. But even as one facet of his quartz mind kept an eye on his enemy, Elijah was pushing more Ethera into another spell. Leveling his staff at the ogre, he let loose with Swarm, manifesting hundreds of biting flies that descended upon the ogre. The creature's armor offered little protection against the tiny insects, and soon enough, they slipped beneath the plates and delivered their afflictions. The ogre bellowed, slapping his meaty hands against his own body in an attempt to smash the little bugs. He got quite a few of them, too. Yet, there were plenty that survived to get the job done. As the ogre unsuccessfully attempted to deal with the insects, Elijah cast another spell. His Ethera was getting low, so he didn't use Calamity or Storm's Fury. Instead, he used Shape of the Guardian to shift into the Scaled 8 form, then launched himself at the distracted ogre. He crashed into the monster in a vicious shoulder tackle before pummeling the prone creature with his fists. Between blows, he snapped out with his powerful jaws, and the sound of rending metal filled the air. It did little good, but Elijah was playing the long game. More evidence of that manifested when the ogre tried to fight back, clawing and punching, but each attack only resulted in painful thorns being embedded in his hands. Elijah kept up the pressure, knowing good and well that if he let the ogre recover even for a second it would spell his doom. So he continued to punch, bite, and kick, each attack buoyed by his immense strength. Still, it wasn't until the combined effects of Contagion, Venom Strike, and Swarm had taken hold that Elijah truly started to win the battle. The ogre's resistance weakened, and its bellowing cries turned into pained moans. And still, Elijah kept on. He didn't grow any stronger as the fight went on, but with the ogre's power being sapped by various afflictions, it certainly seemed like it. Finally, after a few minutes that felt like hours, Elijah finished the creature off with a mighty bite that crushed the ogre's skull. That didn't kill it. The ogre was too durable for that. But its body went mostly limp, save for a series of uncontrolled spasms. Elijah lashed out again, and he felt more bones crunch beneath the might of his jaws. Still, he didn't feel an influx of kill energy, so he attacked again. And again after that. In all, it took 5 more bites before the skull completely shattered like a melon. Finally, a flood of experience washed over him, and he let himself relax as he backed away. The fight had gone almost perfectly, and he had managed to keep the pressure up the entire time. The ogre had never had a chance to regain his balance. Still, it had taken far more damage to put it down than he'd ever expected. But he'd done it. That was all that mattered. Now, though, he needed to repeat the process. So, after taking a few minutes to drag the body out of the way, looting a pouch containing a couple of copper Ethereum along the way, he settled down to recover his Ethera and center his mind. A little less than an hour later, he headed out to repeat the process. His next victim went down a little easier, though he took a bit of damage because he stayed in predator form a little too long. Still, the few broken ribs he'd sustained when the ogre caught him with a wild kick were nothing that a little healing rain couldn't mend. However, the third ogre very nearly killed him. Elijah didn't know if it was just a higher level than the others or some other facet he'd overlooked, but it endured his initial barrage without flinching. Then, it ripped through the entanglement of snaring roots before Elijah had even finished casting Swarm. So he'd been forced to dodge while in caster form, a losing strategy, if ever there was one. Predictably, he'd taken a hit, but fortunately, because he'd had an entire facet of his quartz mind focused on casting Swarm, he managed to complete the spell as he flew across the cellar and hit a cluster of barrels with bone-crushing force. If Elijah hadn't had Shape of the Guardian ready with another facet of his mind, he would have died then and there. However, as it happened, he managed to shift into a scaled ape just in time to meet the ogre's charge. It still wasn't ideal, but after that, the stacked afflictions combined with Shield of Brambles and the enhancements of his durable form was enough to tip the balance in his favor. Even so, it was a long, hard-fought battle that pushed him to his limits. Afterwards, he was forced to spend nearly 10 hours healing himself before he was ready for the 4th battle. That went much better in nearly perfect mimicry of the first fight, and Elijah finished it off without issue. A couple of hours later, he managed to kill the 6th and final ogre guard in the area. Doing so pushed him to level 37, which, on the surface, wasn't nearly as beneficial as it might have once been. However, it put him one step closer to gaining a new ability, which was what he truly considered important at the moment. Even more importantly, killing that 6th ogre meant that he could now focus on clearing the wings to the north and south. So once he'd healed from the final battle, he took a few minutes to eat and drink before setting off toward the fire wing. Hopefully, things would continue to go his way. Report. The first time Elijah attacked one of the ogre guards in the fire wing, he got quite a surprise when it summoned a fireball and tossed it in his direction. Fortunately, he'd kept one facet of his mind focused on the monster, so he narrowly managed to leap aside before the ball of flame swallowed him. Still, it represented a serious deviation from what he'd found clearing the first half-dozen guards. Regardless, the addition of spellcasting ability didn't change his general strategy, so, even as his scales smoked from the near miss, he raced through the corridors to his carefully chosen battleground. He reached it after only half a minute, barreling through the door and slipping to the side just in time to avoid yet another arcing fireball. It splashed against the far wall as Elijah shifted into his human form and cocked back his staff. The moment he caught a hint of the ogre passing through the doorway, Elijah swung his weapon with all the might he could muster. It cracked against the guard's kneecaps hard enough that it would have shattered a lesser staff. However, the Staff of Natural Harmony was a simple grade item, and so it was unnaturally durable. Still, to Elijah, it felt like he'd just hit a brick wall, and the impact sent incredibly painful vibrations through his hands and up his forearms. But the tactic proved its viability when the ogre lost his balance and stumbled through door. Already off balance, the guard couldn't mitigate the effect of Elijah's next attack, which came via a blow across the creature's broad back that sent it into an even more exaggerated stumble. That, in turn, ended with the guard falling flat on its face. Its momentum took it all the way to the far wall. Elijah leveled his staff at the monster, then cast snaring roots. The resulting eruption of vegetation wrapped around the ogre's entire body, encasing it in a cocoon of thorny vines. That was far more effective than if the creature had remained upright, because it robbed the ogre of any leverage. Even so, Elijah knew it would only last a few seconds, so he acted quickly, casting Swarm, then healing Rain in quick succession. He'd shunted the pain from his burning scales into its own facet of his mind, so it didn't affect his cognitive abilities. However, he was still very much aware of it, so he was even more cognizant of the soothing precipitation that healed the damage. Elijah got his next surprise when he saw that Swarm hadn't summoned the biting flies it had in the previous area. Instead, it had manifested hundreds of glowing orange spiders, each one emitting visible heat. They descended upon the prone ogre, their obviously painful bites sending its struggles to a new level of panic. But Elijah barely noticed it. Instead, he was already shifting into the shape of the guardian. The transformation only took a second, but to his impatient mind, it was still too long. In the previous area, he'd come to enjoy the sense of power he felt in the scaled ape form, so he was eager to resume that mighty shape. The moment he felt his body complete its transformation, he loped forward, covering the ground in a couple of hopping steps before he descended upon the panicked and diseased ogre. However, the moment he reached the creature, he got his second shock when the guard erupted into flames hot enough to burn the vines to ash. Fortunately, the swarm of spiders were clearly resistant to the fire, because they were entirely unaffected. Unfortunately, Elijah was very much affected as the flames hit him like an exploding bomb. Even with Ward of the Seasons active, his scales proved to be little protection against the eruption of fire. All along his front, they melted, but his exposure was blessedly brief as he was quickly tossed backward by a shockwave that sent him on a collision course with the wall on the other side of the room. He hit with bone-crunching force, but his body held up surprisingly well to the blunt force impact. Still, when the back of his head hit the stone wall, he saw stars. Whether it was due to his high constitution, or the ongoing effects of healing Rain, Elijah wasn't sure, but he recovered quickly and picked himself up just in time to see the flaming ogre do the same. It bellowed a challenge, slapping its chest with one fist. Then, it gave its bald head the same treatment, reminding Elijah of some of the more unhinged boxers he'd seen during his years participating in the sport. Then it charged, once again taking Elijah by surprise, this time with how quickly it moved. But with the extra time afforded by the sash of the whirlwind, Elijah quickly got over his shock and reacted by dodging to the side. The ogre was afflicted with the same issues that affected Elijah when he was under the influence of Shape of the Guardian, in that it had plenty of strength to propel it forward at incredible speed, but lacked the dexterity to control that power, meaning that he had no chance of changing direction or stopping. He hit the wall headfirst, knocking himself for a loop. He bounced back, then stumbled, shaking its head. That's when Elijah leaped forward, his claws lashing out with all the power he could muster. Fire licked at him as his short, stubby claws gouged into the guard's bare chest. Ward of the Seasons protected Elijah, though, allowing him to continue his attacks against the off-balance creature. Once. Twice. Then 3 times. Each attack dug deeper into the ogre's flesh until Elijah felt bone. However, it was at that point that the guard regained his wits and, with extreme and explosive speed, he punched out. His meaty fist took Elijah in the stomach with an uppercut that launched him toward the ceiling. In the air, he lacked leverage to affect his own movement, so he could do nothing about his fall toward the ogre's follow-up attack that collided with his toothy snout. Once again, Elijah was sent flying across the room, stopping only when he collided with the wall with even more force than his first meeting with the barrier. His breath left his lungs in a rush, and it felt like iron bands wrapped around his chest. Fortunately, healing Rain persisted, soothing his injuries just enough to let him quickly regain his faculties. When he did, he saw something that gave him hope. The ogre was clearly stronger than the guards he'd previously fought. Probably due to that fiery corona surrounding its body. However, Elijah could also see that the ability was a double-edged sword. Blisters had already begun to spread across the ogre's bare skin, and they were worsening by the second. That meant that Elijah only had to endure. That, in turn, meant that he was in for a painful run. Yet, he didn't shy away. If he could deal with being eaten alive by an orca's stomach acid, then he could take whatever the fire ogres could dish out. In theory. In practice, the next few minutes were an exercise in torture as he and the ogre went back and forth. Elijah got in a few hits here and there, but most of the work was done by the still ongoing afflictions as well as the fire that was the origin of the guard's explosive power. Without any of his advantages, whether it was Ward of the Seasons, his enhancements, or his inflated constitution, Elijah would have fallen prey to the ogre's attacks. However, they proved just enough to endure the worst of it until, gradually, the guard wore down. As he did, Elijah's blows landed a little more often until he felt like he was fighting a one-sided battle. Still, every time he drew close to the ogre, his body erupted into fiery agony. So by the time he finally downed the monster, he was drowning in so much pain that he could barely think straight. Still, every second that passed after the ogre's flames winked out, he was healed a little more by healing rain. That, along with his quartz mind, allowed him to drag himself out of that painful abyss. When he did, he shifted back to his human form and started casting Touch of Nature. It took a few hours for him to return to normal, but he didn't immediately set off to pull another ogre to his chosen killing field. Instead, he took quite some time trying to center himself. In theory, enduring pain was just about willpower, but every person had limits. Eventually, enough agony would break anyone, and despite the fact that he'd progressed past human limitations, Elijah was no different. But that wasn't necessarily true, either. By all rights, he should have been riddled with post-traumatic stress, and yet, once he'd recovered, his mind just skated away from all the worst parts of his ordeal. It had been the same with his time in the first tower, which had been incredibly taxing on his psyche. Now, though, he almost looked back on it with fondness. Not the part where he'd been eaten alive by a mutant orca. Or when he'd almost lost himself to his feral side. Or when he'd had a chunk of his side eaten by a giant snapping turtle. Or dozens of other life or death situations. When he looked at it like that, he should have been a mess. And yet, he didn't feel racked with anxiety. In fact, even now, only a couple of hours after enduring the fire ogre's attacks, he felt positively optimistic. Clearly, there was something else at play, but he had no idea what that might be. Nor was Elijah terribly concerned with something that seemed helpful. He couldn't afford to deal with the psychological effects of his adventures, so it was probably better that something, probably the system, or the cultivation of his mind and soul, had dulled it. In any case, once Elijah had recovered mentally and physically, he embarked on a painful and necessary quest to exterminate the fire ogres. The second was just as difficult as the first, but over time, he developed a viable strategy. It was a little more dangerous, but he found that using his caster form a little more generously made things much less painful. So long as he continuously cast snaring roots, weaving storm's fury in, he could remain mostly out of range of the ogre's flames. Of course, he still made mistakes, and there were plenty of close calls. After those fights, he ended up looking a bit like Freddy Krueger. Fortunately, his healing spells kept him from scarring, but he did lose most of his hair. More distressingly, he once again ended up naked when his outfit caught fire and burned to crisp. After that, he stashed his pack in another room before resuming his quest in the nude. After all, he could easily repair his body. His expensive clothes were another story altogether. By the halfway point, Elijah was more than ready to move on. At first, the pain he'd been forced to endure was counterbalanced by the struggle. However, as it had gotten easier, the process had become an unexciting slog. Or as unexciting as being burned alive ever could be, he reasoned. Still, he had no choice but to finish it off, and for two reasons. First, he didn't dare fight the lieutenants while any of the guards still lived. He knew each one would strain his capabilities, so he didn't want to complicate matters by adding a few extra ogres to the mix. The second reason was just as practical, and it centered on the influx of kill energy he received with every slain guard. He'd already reached level 37, and he hoped that, by the time he finished off all the guards in every wing, he would attain level 40 and gain a new spell. But first, he needed to finish the fire ogres. So once he'd healed from the latest fight, he took a deep, steadying breath and got back to work. Icicles hung from the ceiling, and thick frost coated every surface, but Elijah forced himself to ignore the biting cold as he raced through the corridor as quickly as he could manage. Behind him, two hulking ogres, both covered in icy spikes, followed with deceptive speed. Each stride of their long legs ate quite a bit of distance, and they had the strength to propel their massive bodies forward with alarming alacrity. Still, Elijah narrowly outpaced them. But he had no idea what to do next. Two facets of his mind whirled with one idea after another as he searched for some way to salvage the situation, but there were no clever tricks to be found. Especially when he turned a corner and ran headlong into two more icy ogres that should not have been there. He ducked, sliding across the icy slick floor as he avoided a similarly coated axe as it descended on the spot he'd just vacated. It sent shards of ice flying, but by that point, Elijah was already leaping high into the air. But not high enough. Thinking quickly, he used Venom Strike before raking his claws across the face of yet another ice ogre. As it reeled back in pain, Elijah kicked off the creature's shoulder, bounded off the wall, then hit the ground running. The whole thing had only taken little more than a second, but even that was enough to give the pursuing ogres the chance to catch up. Fortunately, they hadn't expected to run into their fellows either, and as a result, one pair collided with another, resulting in a tangled scrum of hulking monsters. That was the opportunity Elijah had been waiting for. He dug his claws into the floor, grinding to a stop. The moment his momentum had been arrested, he whipped around, shifting back to his human form. Even as his body morphed, he threw out his staff and shoved Ethera into calamity. He released it only a moment later, and the fury of nature descended upon the fallen ogres. Lightning cracked. Thunder rolled. And the ground was rent asunder, ripping through the prone monsters without mercy. However, Elijah paid little attention to that. Instead, he was already casting a second spell. As he forced Ethera into swarm, hundreds of crystalline rats formed from the ice on the walls, then scurried forward to fall on the reeling ogres. Even then, Elijah wasn't finished casting. With the influx of levels as well as his advancement in cultivation, his core had grown quite a bit larger than it had been in the beginning. That translated into the ability to cast more spells before he ran dry. So he had plenty of fuel to use in the attempt to salvage the situation his carelessness had foisted upon him. So he channeled Storm's fury through his staff, sending a thick bolt of lightning out to join the storm summoned by Calamity. It struck the closest ogre directly in the upturned face, sending a powerful electrical current arcing through the massive creature's body. But it didn't stop there. Because it was touching all the other ogres who were conveniently clad in iron, which made for a great conductor, the electrical current flowed from one to the other, effectively extending the single cast to 4 targets. So, seeing how effective it was, Elijah cast it again. Then, he went for a third cast, but by that point, he knew he was pushing his luck as well as his core's capacity. So he stepped forward, cocked his staff back, and used Venom Strike before hitting the closest ogre in the face. The staff took the creature in the jaw, and Elijah was rewarded by the sound of breaking bones or cracking ice, perhaps. More importantly, he delivered the neurotoxin of Venom Strike. Ability: Venom Strike. Imbues an attack with fast-acting neurotoxin. Usable in all forms. Damage doubled when in predator form. He used it again before hitting the next closest ogre. However, the moment he connected, his good fortune truly did run out, and the first monster caught him with a wild backhand that sent him stumbling into the frosty wall. Elijah quickly recovered, but by that point, Calamity had ended, and despite the affliction Swarm had delivered, the ogres had begun to pick themselves up from the floor. That was when Elijah decided to once again run. This time, though, he didn't switch into his predator form. Because he had an idea. Dashing to the end of the hall, he turned around to see that the first ogre had climbed to his feet. He stumbled forward in pursuit of Elijah, but his body lacked the strength it had once possessed. Elijah hate. The next ogre found his feet, too. Then, the third. Finally, the fourth lurched upright. By that point, the first creature had reached the halfway point, but still, Elijah held his ground. Just before the last monster resumed his own pursuit, Elijah cast snaring roots. The prickly vines exploded from the ground, eagerly wrapping around the already weakened ogre's legs. For a moment it looked confused that its legs wouldn't move, and then, it tipped back over. The vines continued to snake out, wrapping the ogre in a prone cocoon, but Elijah didn't stick around to watch. Now that he'd slowed one down, he needed to run. So he took off down the corridor, turning down paths he'd memorized. The ogres followed. Although, because they were fighting the afflictions of swarm as well as the neurotoxin of venom strike, their steps were slow and plodding. Due to that, Elijah easily managed to outpace them. So, after a few more minutes dedicated to racing through the halls, he finally felt essence of the wolf take effect. When it did, he didn't hesitate to shift into his predator form, then adopt guise of the unseen. However, he didn't stop. Instead, he padded forward with as much speed as he could muster, then slipped into one of the empty side rooms. It was just in time, too, because the first ogre thundered past the entrance only a second later, completely oblivious that he'd lost Elijah's trail. Even so, he didn't relax. That was what had nearly gotten him killed the first time. But in his defense, how was he supposed to know that the ogres would be able to detect him? He still didn't even know what had prompted their discovery. 1 second, he'd been sneaking along as he searched for a way to separate them and kill them one by one, and the next, one of the huge creatures had wheeled around and aimed a Herculean kick in his direction. It was only due to his faceted mind that he saw it coming and managed to leap aside. What followed was a desperate chase through the corridors that had mercifully just ended. But Elijah wasn't finished. Throughout his flight through the tunnels, one facet of his mind had been working overtime trying to come up with a plan to make the best of the situation, and through some good fortune and quick thinking, he'd managed to engineer just such a chance. Now, he needed to follow through. So, after the second and third ogres rushed past, he crept out and sprinted down the hall to where he hoped to find the final ogre he'd bound with snaring roots. Only a few moments later, he got his wish when he nearly ran into the creature. Without hesitation, Elijah leaped, opened his mouth wide, and used Predator Strike before clamping down on the monster's head. The ogre was wholly unprepared for the attack, and weakened as he was, he had little chance of stopping Elijah's forceful bite. He flexed his jaw, and his teeth bit deep. When he yanked away, a chunk of flesh and bone came with him. The ogre lurched out of control, then crashed into the wall. Elijah bounded free, then darted back in to slash his claws across the creature's hamstrings. Then, he repeated the motion on the ogre's ankles. The creature tumbled to the floor, cracking the ice along the way. In a panic, the monster activated an ability that sent spikes of ice erupting from the ground, but they were unfocused and too slow to catch Elijah. He dodged around them, then leaped on the ogre's back. Digging his claws between the plates of armor, he once again reared back, then struck forward with snapping jaws that tore another chunk from the base of the creature's skull. Knowing what was about to happen, he repeated the action, though this time, he didn't let go or try to tear free. Instead, he latched on with everything he could muster. That's when the ogre managed to push himself to his knees, then launch himself backwards, slamming Elijah against the wall. Still, he didn't let go. Even as he felt his bones creak under the impact, he raked his claws across the monster's back, digging deep even as he continued to apply pressure on the ogre's skull. Letting out a hiss of mingled pain and fury, Elijah tapped into a well of strength he didn't know he possessed, and he was rewarded a moment later with the sound of a skull cracking. A second later, brains and plasma squirted into his mouth as the creature finally succumbed to its many injuries. It collapsed, pinning Elijah against the wall so thoroughly that he was forced to switch into his guardian form to push it out of the way. After finally winning free, Elijah switched back to his caster form, and ran back the way he'd come. As he did so, he channeled Touch of Nature in an attempt to heal his aching bones. He didn't think he'd broken anything, but it was close enough that he knew that ignoring the injuries would be a mistake. His bare feet slapped against the icy floor, though he barely felt the cold. Ward of Seasons, which had taken the place of Essence of the Monkey, had proven invaluable. Once, he'd considered the enhancement to be mostly useless because it did nothing to block the weather. However, in the Ethera-induced cold of the Citadel's ice and fire wings, it had become one of his most important spells. He quickly found his way to another side room. They were all empty, and it felt almost like they'd been included more to make the Citadel seem like a real place than to serve an actual purpose, where he settled into a corner and continued his healing. Fortunately, his injuries were minor compared to some of the damage he'd been forced to endure in the past, so it wasn't long before he was back to perfect condition. As soon as he'd recovered his Ethera, Elijah shifted back into his predator form, then set off through the corridors. After all, he still had quite a few ogres to hunt. 3 of them were already wounded, and he hoped to take care of them first. However, he knew he couldn't afford to be picky. So he stalked through the halls until, at last, he found his next victim. As it turned out, the ogre was not one of the ones he'd already fought. What followed was a systematic dismantling of the force of ogres manning the frost wing of the Citadel. Elijah was ruthless as he slowly picked them apart using similar tactics to the plans he'd employed in the fire wing. However, unlike the fire ogres, the ice ogre's abilities tended more towards defense than doing extra damage, which played right into Elijah's hands. So long as he only fought one at a time, which wasn't easy to arrange, but he managed, the ogres couldn't do much to harm him while in guardian form. Of course, that also meant that each battle was a long, drawn-out affair where Elijah was forced to use every source of damage he could muster, including Shield of Brambles. Still, it was the safest way to proceed. Ironically, the quickest way to deal with the ice ogres was in his human form, when he could chain cast his spells. However, it was simultaneously the most dangerous as well as the least efficient. Each battle he tried to fight in that manner left his core completely drained, and the margin for error was slim enough that if he made even the slightest mistake, he'd end up splattered against the wall. Somewhere in the middle was his scaled panther form. Each fight began with him using Predator Strike and Venom Strike, but after that, he usually switched to one of his other forms for the rest of the battle. However, for a couple, he remained in his Predator form, which proved to be effective but ultimately exhausting. It also was almost as dangerous as fighting in his human form. But he knew it was important to familiarize himself with all the tools at his disposal, so he focused on making each form work in his favor. In that way, he slowly whittled the ogres down, one by one, until he finally killed the last ice ogre in the wing. That last kill came in his guardian form, when he repeatedly slammed a weakened ogre's head against a wall until it finally succumbed to all the damage he'd inflicted. He sagged against the wall, his hissing breath coming in ragged gasps. He'd pushed himself incredibly hard, and as a result, he'd managed to not only clear the last of the ogres from the wing, but he'd also progressed to level 39. One more and he'd get a new spell. But now he had a decision to make. Would he challenge the 2 lieutenants? Or would he assault the next 2 wings? The remaining 2 wings were located up a set of stairs, so they were slightly isolated from his current position. That also suggested that the 2 elves, one of light, and the other of shadow, were slightly above the ogres in the Citadel's hierarchy. In turn, that probably meant that their guards were a little more dangerous. In the end, it came down to one simple fact: he wanted to be at his best when he fought the lieutenants, so that meant he needed to gain at least another level. And that, in turn, made his choice clear. He needed to clear the other wings first, and then he could assault the lieutenants. Hopefully, whatever spell he gained at level 40 would be enough to catapult him to victory.